Apologize for the tardy start. It's not like how this is not the way we'd like to do business, and I'd like for this not to happen again. But thank you for all being here. So with this, I will call this session of the Public Service Commission to order. Secretary Burgess, are there any changes to the final agenda?
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. There are no changes to this morning's agenda.
Okay. Thank you. With that, we will proceed to the regular agenda. The first four items, which relate to utility performance following storms, will be presented with an opportunity for commissioners to ask questions or comment after each item. After the four items have been presented, a vote will be taken on each of the three voting items. The first item for discussion is item 301, case 17E0594, as it relates to the joint proposals addressing the performance of New York State Electric and Gas Corporation and Rochester Gas and Electric Corporation following the March 2017 windstorm, presented by Administrative Law Judge Sean Mullaney. Christian Bonvin, Chief Electric Distribution Systems, is available for questions. Judge Mullaney, please begin.
Good morning, Chairman Rhodes and Commissioners. Thank you. Item 301 is a proposed commission order adopting the terms of two joint proposals, a settlement JP and an investment JP, that would resolve penalty questions and safety concerns identified as a result of staff's investigation into the severe windstorm that struck western New York on March 8, 2017. That storm caused widespread damage within the service territories of New York State Electric and Gas Corporation, or NYSEG, and Rochester Gas and Electric Corporation, RG&E. Together, I'm going to refer to these two companies as the companies. It also affected the service territory of National Grid. Sustained winds in the range of 50 to 70 miles per hour uprooted and snapped trees, causing significant damage to electric infrastructure. The worst of the storm involved winds gusting to 81 miles per hour within the city of Rochester. Downed power lines and poles caused large-scale electric outages in affected areas. Roads were blocked by trees and other debris, hampering transportation and impeding restoration efforts. The strong winds lasted until the early morning of Thursday, March 9, 2017, and the windstorm was immediately followed by a cold front that caused temperatures to dip below freezing, creating further challenges for customers already without heat and electricity. In addition, Winter Storm Stella, which brought sizable snowfall to the northeast, also impacted the area prior to complete service restoration. NYSEG, RG&E, and National Grid reported that overall, more than 250,000 customers experienced a loss of power during the windstorm, with peak customer outages of approximately 123,000 for RG&E, 48,000 for NYSEG, and 113,000 for National Grid. Restoration took until March 13th for NYSEG and until March 15th for RG&E. National Grid restored more than 90% of its affected customers within 36 hours and completed restoration on March 12, 2017. RG&E received and handled 76,426 outage calls between March 8th and March 15th. NYSEG received 66,121 outage calls over a similar period. National Grid received and handled 17,327 outage calls between March 8th and March 12th. In the wake of the windstorm, staff performed an investigation and issued a report, referred to herein as the DPS report, that identified deficiencies in the company's performance. Staff found that National Grid personnel followed the company's emergency response plan and identified no significant issues or deficiencies with National Grid's performance. Therefore, the DPS report focused on performance shortcomings of NYSEG and RG&E. The DPS report led to the Commission issuance of an order commencing this proceeding and, in relevant part, directing NYSEG and RG&E to show cause why the Commission should not pursue an administrative penalty for the company's apparent failure to follow their emergency response plan. And just note that these two companies operate under a common plan. Thereafter, the companies and staff engaged in settlement discussions that ultimately led to the signing and filing of the two joint proposals that are the subject of today's proposed commission order. The settlement JP, in lieu of an administrative penalty action, would resolve the issues concerning 4 alleged emergency response plan violations on the part of NYSEG and 8 alleged emergency response plan violations on the part of RG&E. The companies would pay a quote-unquote settlement amount of $3.9 million from shareholder funds. This amount would be allocated in the sum of $2.8 million to RG&E Electric and $1.1 million to NYSEG Electric, based on the outages experienced in each of these companies' respective service territories. The settlement amount reasonably approximates the potential total penalty amount if the matter were to be fully litigated pursuant to Public Service Law Section 25-A. And that accounts for 12 alleged violations at approximately $500,000 per violation as specified under the statute. The signatory parties to the settlement JP agreed that the expenditure of these funds by the companies should not be construed as a commission finding or an admission by the companies of a violation of any law or regulation or order of the commission, nor construed as an assessment of a fine or penalty. Second JP, the investment JP, describes how the settlement amount would be used for the benefit of ratepayers. The programs to be funded under the investment JP will address some important safety-related concerns that were described in the DPS staff report and identified in the Commission's previously issued order to show cause. These investments would not be reflected in the company's rate base or operating expenses when establishing future delivery rates. In general, funds will be used for more effective event response prioritization, more effective communications between the companies and their customers that are dependent upon electronically powered life support equipment, enhanced storm response capabilities, faster restoration of critical facilities, improved wires down procedures, and increased electric system resiliency. No party to the proceeding opposes either of the joint proposals, and no public comments have been received regarding the joint proposals. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Mullaney. My sense, my view is that this represents a good and balanced proposal, recognizing the severity of the event, which is a factor that is outside any human organization's control. It delivers accountability with respect to the company's performance against their commitments that they made in the ERPs, the emergency response plans. And it then goes on to propose a balanced and useful set of investments. I'm going to support this item. Commissioner Sarah?
Like many of the people in this room, especially those from Western New York, as I am, I remember that storm very well indeed. It was disappointing at the time that NYSEG and RG&E took longer to restore service than National Grid, given relatively comparable service territories and damages. This item, in my view, gets at some of the problem areas, but as we're going to see later in today's agenda, there's a lot of work to be done on storm response. I do, however, support the steps proposed in this item.
Commissioner Berman.
I'm going to withhold my specific comments on how I'm voting on this till after all of the items are done, and then we'll discuss that, but I do have a couple of threshold questions. The order to show cause, so the storm was on March 8th, 2017, correct? And the
Yes.
order to show cause and the report was initiated, the report was finalized on November 16th, 2017, which was the day that the order to show cause went forward. From the time, so from March to November 17th, how much of that was active investigation? So when did the investigation start and when did the investigation complete? Not when the report was done, but when the investigation was completed.
So we began our investigation following completion of restoration. There's procedural things that they file. There's a report that's due 30 days afterwards. There's also a report that's due 60 days afterwards. But we probably started, I'd have to check to make sure that we actually issue the IRs before those, but we likely did, because we usually try to get some information before those reports are filed as well to solidify some of that. I guess I would also probably say that the investigation continues until the report is finalized, because as we're writing the report, we are very much active in terms of rewriting sections that are getting questions or need bolstering. In some cases, we might need to go back and get more information. In other cases, we might have that. So, in terms of, interviews and things like that, those happen more towards the beginning. But IRs continue to occur throughout these as we're trying to fill in holes as we're going through and writing together our findings and making sure that we have proper support.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. So that's about 8 months from start to finish then, if we use that timeline. For the settlement JP and the investment JP, both of them occurred when? When they were filed, I think, May 18th.
They're both signed as of May 18th,
Right.
2018.
Okay. And then they got SAP'd June 13th, 2018, right?
I don't know offhand, Commissioner.
Okay. And a notice for comments was issued June 6, 2018. At least that's what my notes have. And comments were due August 13th, 2018. Okay. And there was also an ALJ procedural ruling on June 6, 2018, at the same time with the notice for comments that discussed if anybody had any comments or questions. So it was basically at that point, pens were down in terms of the investment JP and the settlement JP, looking at that from my notes. It's not meant to be controversial. I'm just trying to get the timeline established. During the investigation, there is under the law also other things, like you said, that have to get filed, the Part 105 filings, correct? And what does staff normally do with that?
So the Part 105 filings are part of our investigation. We review those for to determine what the company's position is on how the storm impacted them, how they responded. We also compare that information to information we gather through other sources, and as well as look at what they produce as after action items, which is required as part of those reports, to see areas where they feel they've found deficiencies, to make sure that we're seeing the same items. So they're very much part of our review and help us ask a few more questions that we might not have seen through either interviews or our own experiences that we obtain.
Okay. At the time of the order to show cause, November 16th, 2017, when we identified 30 recommendations, 4 of those were actually emergency response plan violations for NYSEG, and 8 of those were actually emergency response plan violations for RG&E. So the others were recommendations outside of the emergency response plan, in additional to, correct?
I'm not sure that I can't say without looking into it closely whether that's a fair and accurate characterization. It may be that some of the recommendations related to improved procedures under the ERP, but related to matters that were not deemed of such a magnitude as to constitute a quote-unquote violation of those plans.
Okay, that's helpful. In the future, it would also be helpful to know when we have recommendations that are new or fleshing out something in the emergency response plan to directly tie it to what section of the emergency response plan, because it's helpful to me when I look through the emergency response plans to match it up. And if it's not in the emergency response plan, where you see it as potentially going is helpful, because that's an area I think that will help not only me as a commissioner, but the public too, who will be looking at those emergency response plans, and the company as well, to see if that is in line with what they would be thinking as they amend the plans. At the time of the November 16, 2017 order to show cause, were the 30 recommendations already being done? And if not, how many of them were already being done or agreed to be done by the company, by the companies?
Could you just repeat the time frame?
What I'm trying to understand is we had 30 recommendations we made in our order to show cause. Those recommendations may have already been being done or agreed to by the companies. My question is, how many of those 30 recommendations had already come to consensus on the part of the company, maybe in working with the various stakeholders, including staff? So out of those 30 recommendations, how many already was the company saying they were going to do or doing since our recommendations or as a part of our recommendations? It's important to me to understand when we issued the November 2017 order to show cause, was the company already doing those or planned to do them, or were they different and therefore they needed to be ordered to do them?
So I would say a certain number of them, they were already in process. Whether or not they were completely parallel to what we exactly required is something that we'd probably be able to dig into and come back with a little more clarity. After issuing our order, we did meet with them in December, where they gave an implementation plan, and we worked very much in hand with them during the beginning parts of 2018 to help redo their plan so that we could make sure that the plan was acceptable and incorporated our recommendations the way that we needed them to be done. So we worked very closely with them. That process was getting very close to the end when the March storms occurred in 2018.
Thank you. That's helpful. So at the time of the investigation during those 8 months and engaging with the various stakeholders and also looking at the self-assessment reports from the company, how much engagement happened with staff and the company in terms of a review of that self-assessment and what might be incorporated into the filing in December 2017 for the upcoming emergency plan that would also fold into any recommendations that came out of this order to show cause?
So as we were going through the report, going through our investigation, we would ask a lot of questions. We would go do our investigatory process. They could certainly read into probably a lot of our questions, areas where we had concern. They put together issues that they were either working on themselves or knew that were concerns to us as part of that December 15th filing. It wasn't complete. It did include some areas, and not just for RG&E and NYSEG, but other areas. The one example that pops into my head is we worked on a process to incorporate municipalities, resources for municipalities to get engaged as part of the response activities. There was a process that was developed in 2018 that kind of solidified how you'd request them, how they would be obtained. That all got worked through. That was all codified in the 2018 filings. So that part was kind of going on a separate track than what was happening, especially where it included all of the utilities and was a known issue that would benefit all utilities is by making sure that process was clear. So some of that was happening, but there was certainly some aspects of what we put out that weren't included, which is what we spent the time in December and the beginning of 2018 doing.
Okay, thank you. With the settlement joint proposal between the staff and the two companies, was there any outreach to other stakeholders who might want to be a part of the settlement discussions? Formal outreach?
I believe the company would have filed a notice of settlement negotiations. I don't know off the top of my head whether that took place or not.
Yeah, for the settlement negotiations, there was a notice that was put out. We used the listing that was based off of the latest RG&E's, the previous RG&E rate case, as kind of who we canvassed, and then from there, you have the listing of who participated. I know It was 4 or 5 participants as part of those settlement negotiations, or for the part of the negotiations for the settlement agreement.
Yeah, the settlement agreement was negotiated and executed by and between the companies and department staff, because they're the only parties that would be parties to an enforcement proceeding if one were brought. The investment JP was negotiated by and between a larger number of parties as described in the materials.
So the only parties that could be a part of the settlement joint proposal discussions or settlement would be the companies and the staff, no outside external stakeholders that might want to be a part of it.
And I don't know if anyone else wants to expand on this, but that's my understanding of how it was structured. And that's why 2 different JPs were actually negotiated.
Right, okay. Thank you. That's all. I'm going to withhold my comments to all of the reports or all of the items. So thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Lisi.
Thank you. At least for what we're dealing with here, without regard to what's coming up later, I think that this is at least a fair, reasonable approach. But I would say for the record that having gone through that, measuring this response and almost turning a blind eye to the requirements and the responsibilities of the utilities, that if you measure the response of National Grid and the RG&E and NYSEG, as I watched that all unfold, in reality, my disappointment went to disbelief. But with regard to this particular approach and a settlement, I think it accomplishes what we're looking to do with regard only to this issue and not issues that may come up later on. So I'll be supporting it.
Thank you very much. So with that, we will proceed to the discussion of our second item for discussion. Item 302A, case 19M0285, which is an informational presentation on Department of Public Services staff report on its investigation into the performance of utilities following the 2018 winter and spring storms, presented by Christian Bonvin, still Chief of Electric Distribution Systems, which will be followed by item 302B, cases 19E0105 et al. As they relate to the staff's investigation, presented by Nicholas Forrest, Assistant Counsel. Bruce Alch, Chief Retail Access and Economic Development, is available for questions. Christian, please begin.
Good morning. Today I'll be discussing staff's investigation into the performance of the utilities regarding the winter and spring storms that affected New York in 2018. Most notable were winter storms Riley and Quinn, which occurred less than 1 week apart. Beginning on March 2nd, heavy wet snow and high winds associated with Winter Storm Riley resulted in electric outages across the state, with peak outages of approximately 131,000 for NYSEG, 93,000 for Con Edison, 85,000 for National Grid, 80,000 for Central Hudson, 41,000 for PSEG Long Island, 32,000 for Orange and Rockland, and 14,000 for RG&E. The lower to mid-Hudson Valley area was particularly hard hit by Riley. Fallen trees, broken poles, down wires, and blocked roads made it difficult for emergency responders and residents. Con Edison, NYSEG, and Orange and Rockland were still restoring customers when Winter Storm Quinn arrived. Quinn caused peak outages of approximately 162,000, many of which were in the same areas impacted by Riley, and Quinn delayed the restoration of customers originally impacted by Riley. Full restoration of service for most of the utilities following Quinn occurred on March 10th. Customers in Con Edison's and Orange and Rockland's territories, however, were not fully restored until March 12th. Staff began its investigation immediately following winter storms Riley and Quinn. However, Mother Nature had more to offer. On April 4th, a windstorm brought damaging winds and widespread rain to many areas of the state, including western New York. The April windstorm, with reported wind gusts above 70 miles per hour, caused peak outages of approximately 84,000 for National Grid, approximately 42,000 for NYSEG and RG&E combined. On May 4th, another windstorm caused approximately 125,000 outages in National Grid service territory and approximately 35,000 customer outages in NYSEG service territory. Finally, on May 15th, severe thunderstorms impacted the mid to lower Hudson Valley area. The concentrated storm, which included 3 tornadoes, caused approximately 70,000 peak outages for Central Hudson, 69,000 for NYSEG, and 46,000 for Orange and Rockland. Because these subsequent events had restoration periods over 3 days, we combined our review of these storms as part of our investigation. Staff's investigation reviewed whether the utilities were properly prepared for and how they responded to the effects of the storms. Staff also examined the communication used to inform customers, emergency management personnel, government officials, and the media of the company's restoration efforts. Staff's investigation considered a number of factors, including a review of compliance with the company's emergency response plan, discussion with the public officials, comments received as part of 20 public statement hearings, comments filed directly with the department, interviews with utility personnel, and analysis of the company's reports and responses to over 700 information requests. While staff found certain areas where companies performed appropriately, our investigation found several areas where companies did not perform well, instances where they did not follow processes that identified in their emergency response plan, and opportunities for improvement. Overall, our report includes 94 recommendations. Some of the recommendations are company-specific, while others promote best practices or enhance existing practices for all utilities. Specifically, staff's investigation found the companies were slow in obtaining outside resources needed to execute a timely restoration. Staff found the mutual assistance process was not effective and inefficient during these events. Additionally, staff found that the internal staffing levels at NYSEG and Con Edison have steadily declined, limiting their ability to respond when outside resources are scarce. Although contractors are being used to help offset the decline, we find it appropriate for these companies to provide plans to increase their internal resources to ensure proper levels are on hand and also seek ways to increase access to outside resources. Road clearing was a major concern during winter storms Riley and Quinn, as well as the May thunderstorms. In certain instances, residents were trapped because fallen wires prevented people from being able to vacate neighborhoods, and more importantly, prevented the ability of first responders to access these areas in case of an emergency. Staff found responses were uncoordinated and lacked an overall prioritization given the multiple requests by municipalities. Although some process changes implemented following Riley allowed for a better response in subsequent events, there is still much progress that can be made. Staff also found that wire guard resources were stretched and the National Guard was called on to assist certain utilities with guarding wires. NYSEG also failed to perform damage assessment effectively despite modifications to its plan. Our report identified 14 recommendations to improve the road clearing efforts and increase trained resources that can be used as damage assessors and wire guards. One of the largest areas of concern we heard was regarding the accuracy of estimated restoration times, or ETRs. NYSEG had major shortcomings how it determined ETRs, which resulted in the company having to revise its ETRs. Staff also concluded that the failure to properly test IT systems used to predict customer impact or communicate ETRs led to misinformation being released and exacerbated customer confusion. During Riley and Quinn, Con Edison and O&R incorrectly notified customers that their power was restored or that they were experiencing an outage. Additionally, the websites for these companies were out for an extended period of time. Our report includes 10 recommendations to fortify IT systems used, disable the provision of incorrect information, and provide ETRs that are more accurate and easier to comprehend by customers and government officials. Staff's review of the restoration process identified multiple areas to improve the efficiency of the utilities, including but not limited to minimizing travel times of crews and crew guides, ensuring staging areas are located in close proximity to work sites, and better coordination with telecommunications providers. Given that many of the resources used were from outside the areas, ample crew guides are necessary, and the utility should seek how to enhance resources that could be used in this capacity. Additionally, staff identified that the expectations and understanding regarding critical facilities was not the same between all parties, leading to frustration, inefficiencies, and delayed restoration of key facilities. This is an area where much collaboration among the utilities, counties, and municipalities during non-storm times will produce major dividends. Staff report contains 19 recommendations to improve and coordinate restoration. With respect to communications, the utilities are expected to use several tools to provide information to customers and the public, including press releases, websites, call centers, and social media. Staff found several areas where the utilities failed to meet the department and public's expectation to provide timely, accurate, and detailed information. Additionally, several officials expressed frustration with the municipal call process due to the information being provided on the call, disorganization of the call, and extended length of the calls, which in some cases lasted over 2 hours for Con Edison and NYSEG. Staff offers more than 20 recommendations to improve the communication and municipal call processes. Dissatisfaction with the communication process was extended into the liaison process. Utility liaisons, which are meant to be a strong point of contact for operations centers and local leaders, were not effective as they were not able to provide detailed information or resolve escalated concerns. Concerns with liaisons were exacerbated when the personnel assigned lacked knowledge about the geography, stakeholders, and system configurations in the areas to which they were assigned. Staff's report contains 5 recommendations to improve communications and strengthen the municipal liaison programs by providing liaisons localized information prior to and during an event to support the efforts of the counties and municipalities. Customers using life support equipment, referred to as LSE customers, are always a major consideration during power outages. Utilities must maintain daily contact with LSEs customers during an event. This is typically done through phone conversation. However, if a company is unable to make contact by phone, an in-person visit is required. Site visits may be performed with utility staff or through third parties, such as an EOC or first responder. Staff, however, discovered that NYSEG and Con Ed failed to contact all impacted LSE customers. Staff also found that the utilities were not consistent in logging and tracking communications with LSE customers, including communications once the customers were referred to others assisting in performing site visits. As a result, the report includes 7 recommendations to help ensure all LSE customers are properly contacted in the case assistance is needed. Finally, staff's investigation identified numerous areas where the utilities potentially did not follow their emergency response plan. These potential violations negatively impacted utility performance. I will now turn it over to Nick to elaborate on the potential violations and resulting next steps.
Good morning, Chair Rhodes. Good morning, Commissioners. Item 302B, the draft order before you, initiates a proceeding and orders New York State Electric and Gas Corporation, Rochester Gas and Electric Corporation, Consolidated Edison of New York Incorporated, Orange and Rockland Utilities Incorporated, Central Hudson Gas and Electric Corporation, and Niagara Mohawk Power Corporation doing business as National Grid to show cause within 30 days why the Public Service Commission should not commence a civil penalty action or an administrative penalty action pursuant to Public Service Law Sections 25 and 25A for alleged violation of each utility's 2018 emergency response plans, approved by the Commission on an interim basis in Case 17E 0758, pursuant to 16 NYCRR Part 105. Further, the utilities are directed pursuant to this draft order to show cause why the utilities should not implement and incorporate the recommendations contained in staff's 2018 winter and spring storm report into each utility's emergency response plan. As discussed in my colleague Mr. Bonvin's presentation, in the wake of winter storms Riley and Quinn, the Department of Public Service began a comprehensive investigation of New York's major electric utilities following the storm response and restoration efforts of the state's electric utilities, which expanded to include storms that occurred in the spring of 2018. The Department's investigation considered whether each utility, including PSEG Long Island, properly prepared for and appropriately responded to the effects of the 2018 winter and spring storms in compliance with their annually filed emergency response plans, Commission regulations and orders, the Public Service Law, and the Public Authorities Law. Upon completion of the Department's investigation and analysis, staff concluded the utilities' protocols and practices need to improve during outage events. Further, in some instances, the ability of the utilities to provide safe and adequate service under Public Service Law Section 65(1) can be called into question. Staff identified numerous potential regulatory violations which warrant Commission action requiring the utilities to formally respond to the conclusions drawn in staff's report and this draft order. Staff identified over 40 potential violations in the areas of damage assessment, estimating restoration times, maintaining a functioning outage management system during periods of storm response, effectuating life support equipment customer communications, and conducting appropriate and effective communications through the utility's press releases, interactive voice response system, website, and call center staffing. NYSEG had the most potential violations, followed by Con Edison and Orange and Rockland. The Department's review of the utilities' performance during the 2018 winter and spring storms identified many opportunities for improvement that, in staff's opinion, should be resolved by implementing the Department's recommendations discussed in staff's report and this draft order. Per the order, the utilities should address the implementation of each specific recommendation contained in the DPS report, whether the Commission should mandate, reject, or modify in whole or in part such recommendations. Staff recommends that each utility's response include a discussion of which recommendations it opposes, the reasons for such opposition, and any indication of any alternatives it proposes to address the root cause of all recommendations to which it is objecting. In addition, the utility should demonstrate how any alternative more effectively addresses the issues identified in staff's underlying findings, how those alternatives produce more or greater benefits, less risk, and/or are more technically feasible. For recommendations opposed without any alternative, staff believes the utility should provide a justification as to why alternatives are not available and/or are not feasible. Finally, to the extent a recommendation or recommendations have already been initiated, staff recommend that the utilities evidence their agreement to the implementation along with an appropriate compliance timeline. Furthermore, PSEG Long Island should comply with the ERP process as contemplated by the Public Service Law, Public Authorities Law, and their amended and restated Operation Services Agreement with the Long Island Power Authority. As provided for in the draft order, to ensure the timely implementation of the recommendations into each utility's ERP, the utilities other than PSEG Long Island are ordered to respond within 30 days of the date of the issuance of this order to show cause, and within 10 days regarding the recommendations to the utility that the utilities have accepted or have begun to implement. Concerning the Department's identification of violations of the utilities' ERPs, the Commission's ERP order, and its regulations under 16 NYCRR Part 105, as contemplated in the draft order, the utilities are ordered to show cause within 30 days of the date of this order, while the Commission should not seek administrative penalties for the company's failure to comply with the requirements of its own procedures contained in their respective ERPs, thereby violating each utility's ERP order and 16 NYCRR Section 105.6. While staff's 2018 winter and spring storm report forms the basis for this draft order to show cause, it should be noted that this order is not a final determination by the Commission concerning staff's report and staff's identification of violations. Rather, it provides an opportunity for the utilities to submit their response to staff's report and the further identification of various violations. Their submissions will continue to develop the record in these cases and enable staff to work with the utilities to implement its recommendations regarding their ERPs, and in turn further enable the Commission to act upon the utilities showing regarding the identified violations. This concludes my presentation. Christian Bonvin and I are now available to answer any of your questions. I appreciate the opportunity to present this item. Thank you.
Thank you. I see this storm report as a well-documented presentation of findings and evidence that are gathered through a thorough and probing investigation, as well as an impactful and justified set of recommendations. I think all of us are going to make the same point that we can't control Mother Nature, and sometimes she just delivers a major event. But what we can control collectively is whether we are organized so to be as effective as possible in the run-up to the event and then during the event. I see the recommendations as doing a very good job of taking learnings from what we learned about ourselves and where there were gaps and shortcomings and we could do better, and find them to be a very solid set of improvement actions, which is, of course, the ultimate goal of all this. We're basically trying to do better next time. I find the order to show cause items to be appropriate. They're appropriate steps to deliver accountability. The utilities, in varying degrees, had a failure in delivering on their commitments to New Yorkers. Mostly with respect to the actions that they should be taking before and during, and the communications that they should be delivering on before and during. I think this is a well done bit of staff work. Commissioner Sayre.
I am personally convinced that climate change is making storms more frequent and more severe. Like the chair, I see this problem as a serious one that utilities just simply have to address. And like the chair, I commend staff for a very thorough review and its nearly 100 recommendations. This problem is only going to get worse until we address climate change. I think we have to take whatever steps we need to take here at the Commission to ensure that we have resilient plant, adequate service, and speedy restoration. Compared to the years when I was growing up, extended outages are much more disruptive to daily lives and the economy of the state. In terms of daily lives, it's particularly important for people to have a good idea of when an outage is going to be cleared so that they can make the basic decision whether they're going to stick it out and stay in place or whether they need to find some place to go. Staff's report has many recommendations in this area for improvements, and I look forward to working with those improvements. Overall, there must be many other improvements to communications from utilities to their customers, particularly with respect to those on life support equipment. I support the use of every tool at the Commission's disposal to drive the necessary improvements in these areas. I'm in favor of these items.
Thank you. Commissioner Berman.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to hold my specific comments and how I'm going to vote till after all of the items are discussed. I do have a couple of questions surrounding the 302 item, but it also may bleed into follow-up with Judge Mullaney on 301, so I just want to make you aware of that. In the 302 item, before us today is an order to show cause. The storms occurred, the 5, March 3rd, 2018, March 7th, 2018, April 4th, 2018, May 4th, 2018, May 15th, 2018. Those 5 storms were part of a collective investigation and report, which is before us today. So, from that period to now, the same question I asked at 301, how much of the time when you started the investigation till pencils down, not when the report was finalized, but when your investigation was complete, how much time was devoted to that?
So, like the other one, I would say our investigation continued throughout much of that. In this event, I can say for certain we were doing interviews with counties and municipalities in July, so that process was still ongoing even through then. I think the mandatory filing for the Part 105 didn't even come in until July for the May event. So, having those extra events certainly extended the time frame compared to the start time of the May event, of the March storms, and added complexity. And I know for that one, we issued IRs even in December.
Okay. So we're looking at almost a year from the end of the last storm, over a year from the beginning of the first storm in 2018 until it comes before us. With that, in between that, there was an order approving the emergency response plans. So the 2017 emergency response plans were approved on an interim basis April 19th, 2018. Is that correct?
That's correct, Commissioner.
Okay. And at that time, all of the recommendations from the 2017 event the 30 were incorporated in some fashion into the ones that we were now approving on an interim basis in the April 19th, 2018 order.
So the ERP process, as they are approved on an annual basis, is really an iterative process. Obviously, as the plans improve, they go through refinement year after year. So to the extent that implementation of certain recommendations contained in the 2017 report were included, I'd have to double check on the extent to which they were included, but it is an ongoing process.
Okay. It's important for me to know when we're looking at this and looking at not only order to show causes on certain recommendations, but then looking at the approval of the plans to know if those recommendations were incorporated into the most recent plan that's coming up for our approval, and if not, why not, and why they changed, because there may have been a valid reason, but it also gives me a window into whether or not the initial recommendations that came in the order to show cause actually then found its way into the emergency response plans, and if not, why not?
I would say a significant number of the recommendations from the 2017 storm were in the plans that were approved last year. Again, most of that work was being done prior to the event occurring.
Okay.
That we were doing very well on a lot of those recommendations. But I would have to double check again to make sure to get an exact count of how many were or weren't.
Okay, great, thank you. Now there's about 94 recommendations, is that correct? And out of these recommendations, how many of them were violations of the existing, which would be the 2017 emergency response plan approved in 2018, I believe?
So I would
How many?
differentiate between recommendations as they're contained in the report and the identification of violations. While many of the recommendations seek to address issues that were violations, the number of violations and recommendations are not subsumed within one another.
Right, that's my point. So my question is, how many of those recommendations were in the emergency response plan? How many of these are violations of the existing 2018, which is the 2017 emergency response plan that was approved in 2018?
So we use the approved plans as a basis to determine whether or not the companies were acting with them, because we specifically asked whether or not those were in use, what plan they were using when they went into the March storms, and then for subsequent storms they were actually approved. So it's clear.
So the March storm would have been the 2017 order that approved the 2016 plans. Is that correct?
So
I may be wrong on my years, but it's why it's important to know when we're looking at these, are we looking at it for the existing plan or the old plan?
So we were looking at it, I guess for the March Riley and Quinn storms, we were using plans that were filed. That was their latest version, although they had yet to be approved. We were working on modifications that were in there,
Right.
and those were the plans that they were using to respond to those events.
Okay.
So we based our analysis off of that. And then, again, for the May one, it's a lot cleaner because those plans were approved, so
Right.
they were using those approved
Okay.
plans.
That makes sense. Thank you. Out of these 94 recommendations, they're actually in several buckets. There's 17 buckets. I'm going to read each one. 1, road clearing efforts. 2, wire guarding. 3, resource acquisition and mutual assistance. 4, damage assessment. 5, outage management systems. 6, estimated time of restoration. 7, restoration process. 8, restoration of critical facilities. 9, mass communications. 10, municipal liaisons. 11, municipal calls. 12, call center operations. 13, life support equipment customers. 14, dry ice distribution. 15, customer reimbursements. 16, hardening the electric system. 17, telecommunication provider service reliability and resiliency. And actually, I miscounted. It's 18 is for tree management. So out of these 18 buckets, we came up with then sub-recommendations, so 94. I think it's important for us to recognize that we're looking at 18 as primary recommendations and 94 of sub-recommendations. So when we look at this, it is while we're announcing 94 recommendations, it's really out of 18 primary recommendations that then 94 sub-recommendations come from. So for me, it's important to look at that and each one of those recommendations in those buckets and see what we're saying for each one. Out of these 94, it applied across the board pretty consistently to all electric utilities, these recommendations. However, there were some recommendations that were then identified as just going to one particular company or several particular companies. Out of these, it's a smaller number for NYSEG, RG&E, O&R, Con Ed, PSC&G, and Central Hudson that have specific ones attached to them rather than the collective whole. Is that fair?
That would be fair, Commissioner.
Okay. So the recommendations as to some of these, I think, apply to all of the utilities across the board, but then we identify some specific ones for a utility. I'm in particularly focused on one right now, which is the IVR for Central Hudson, and why that was given. It was Central Hudson, Con Ed, National Grid, and PSC&G Long Island. I'm a little confused by that because I had thought that was not an issue for Central Hudson on this IVR recommendation. Is that a mistake?
I believe Mr. Alch can answer that question for you, Commissioner.
Well, Mr. Walsh would like to get back to you on the specifics on that one. That's pretty,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah, I didn't think there were any issues with their response. And I'm not saying I didn't. I believed that we had gotten something, so I just am flagging that in case that needs to be updated.
I'll get back to you on
Okay.
details.
Thanks. Is there, for each of these recommendations, is there a cost attached to if they're implemented, what that cost would be?
So there isn't a cost attached for doing that. However, for some of the ones that we know will have sizable costs, we request a plan with budgets and timeframes for implementation. So we
Okay.
are seeking what the cost will be before taking steps as part of rate cases or other actions.
Okay. So there has actually not been a benefit cost analysis done to date on these recommendations.
No, that's correct, Commissioner. I think the order to show cause also offers the utilities an opportunity to provide alternatives or less costly alternatives that may accentuate and develop the record for future determinations.
Okay. When we take these into account and we're in the order to show cause saying that we want them to do this unless they have alternatives or some other reason, essentially we're expecting that these will be there in some form, whether there's these recommendations or some alternative, but we have not yet actually identified what that would mean from a cost perspective going forward. Not looking back on the penalty portion, but going forward. If they adopted each and every one of these recommendations and said, yes, we agree, we will put these in our plans. We cannot come up with an alternative that's less costly. What would that dollar figure be? And why haven't we done an analysis?
So we didn't do an analysis of the entire one. I think some are simple and probably are low cost, and those are the ones such as reworking who's responsible for certain activities within your plan, how you go to manage and do other activities to make sure that things are executed properly. Again, we kind of noted the ones that we knew were going to have significant budget impacts or activities that weren't already being done by the companies themselves, and asked for that information so we could do a more holistic view of what it would take, as well as part of integrating that in with other activities to determine, what is the best schedule for tree trimming, for example, instead of deciding it in a isolated vacuum.
So will they get to not on the penalty portion of it, but going forward, will they be able to have full cost recovery if all 94 of these recommendations, plus the others that are in the emergency response plans, how does that work in terms of cost recovery?
That would be covered in a separate rate case proceeding.
Okay. But because they're mandated going into it, would it be true or fair to say that they would expect cost recovery because they were mandated to do these and the commission is then going to approve that? So going into it, there's a dollar figure that we should expect, at least a figure, that these are costing, this plus anything else, and we'll take care of it in a rate case.
I think the order to show cause itself, separate from the violation component, just to be clear, allows for discussion of those concerns. And so I think it's preemptory to assume that we've worked to a determination on, what items will be accepted, rejected, modified, etc., and the ultimate conclusion of where we'll land on some of these recommendations. Obviously, it's staff's assertion that, as it's recommending to the utilities that they do and go forward with these items, but it is not ultimately a determination that is forcing those utilities to do that as of yet.
Okay. I'll save my comments for after all we do that. With LIPA and PSE&G, they obviously also were investigated. PSE&G Long Island was investigated in looking at what could be done, and recommendations were adopted. What is the process that happens after this for them, and is there any order to show cause that would come against them?
So as is noted in the order, there's a separate procedure as laid out in the Public Service Law, the Public Authorities Law, and as required by the amended and restated services agreement with the Long Island Power Authority between PSEG and the Power Authority. So they are to follow that process, which includes a similar process to the filings that are filed by the utilities for their ERPs to include recommendations from staff. And so staff would go through that process with PSEG Long Island to that extent to discuss its recommendations.
So LIPA could also then bring an order to show cause?
I don't believe LIPA would necessarily bring an order to show cause. I think that's a little bit more far afield from our discussion, but ultimately the PSE&G Long Island is required by the Public Authorities Law as LIPA service provider to file with the department its emergency response plan, which then is subject to a review and recommendation by the department, and then ultimately adopted by the LIPA board.
So what are they adopting, the LIPA board, to be clear?
The LIPA board is adopting PSE&G's PSE&G Long Island's emergency response plan.
Okay. And there's no discussion of, as there is here for the other utilities, a penalty action?
That's correct, Commissioner.
Okay. So so here it's only those utilities under our jurisdiction, and there would not be ever a penalty action against PSE&G Long Island?
That's correct. The jurisdiction under 25 and 25A does not apply to PSE&G Long Island.
Okay. In all of the discussion in the orders to show causes, we've been focused on emergency response plans that the utilities have to file. What about the scorecards that came about from 2013 order?
So the data that was included as part of the scorecards was included as a part of our review and analysis, and that also triggered certain areas where we looked into poor performance or helped gauge performance. One that comes to mind, an easier one, is the requirement to contact LSEs with 80% of the LSEs within 12 hours. That's
Okay.
a measure, and that's what we worked into the plans to codify it better, and that's one of the items that we have noted in our report as certain companies not being able to perform.
So after today, if the companies accept all of the recommendations, what's the next step? Those companies that have that we have jurisdiction over.
So the next step for those utilities would be per the order to file with the in response to the order to show cause their responses, and if they were to modify or adopt all of those recommendations, we would then use those filings to come back to the commission.
Okay. And in December 2018, the utilities that we have jurisdiction over filed emergency response plans, their 2018 emergency response plans. Have those been SAP'd?
Yes, they were SAP'd as soon as they were filed.
They were SAP'd?
Correct.
Okay. Council Sipos, is that correct? Okay, thank you. So those are SAP'd, and now there is an amendment process. Is that correct?
That's correct, Commissioner.
And those any amendments to it would not be SAP'd. Is that correct, or would they have to be SAP'd?
I believe the utilities file a revised plan during the process that it then is presented to the commission.
But those revisions to those plans, those amendments, that would potentially incorporate these 94 recommendations that may or may not have costs attached to them would not be SAP'd. Is that correct? We would be working off of the ones that were filed for the original December 2018 plans.
For the purposes of the SAPA notice itself, it's based on the original filing in December.
Okay. Normally, if we didn't have the investigation report and now the order to show cause, from the beginning of the December 2018 filings, which are December 15, 2018 under the law, that's when they're supposed to be filed by, normally when would we be looking at then adopting, with modifications or not, the plans? What's the session that we would normally do that around, assuming we SAP it right away?
It's an approximate. I mean, I don't want to be married to an individual date, but ultimately it's in the springtime around now.
Right. Okay. Like last year, we did it April 19th, 2018. The year before that, I think, was similar.
That's correct, Commissioner.
Okay. So now, with this, with the next steps on this order to show cause, not as the penalty portion, but as to these direct recommendations. Now, if there was a storm that happened, let's say after session, the order is issued, the utilities agree to all of these recommendations, but we still have not adopted the 2018 plans in 2019. If there's a storm, what are we looking at in terms of whether or not there are violations? We're looking at the old plan, not this, because we're not doing anything here. This is an order. We're not doing anything affirmatively as to adopting these recommendations, even if the utilities accept all of them.
Right. So if we had another storm event and there was going to be an investigation following, I think we'd do similar to what we did in the first questions that we asked, which is to say, which plans were you following? And if we already didn't have a copy of that, we would request a copy so that we could analyze and compare against what their plan that they were using versus that. And, to the extent that was omitting pieces that were filed in or back in December that were suddenly removed for some reason, we would note that as part of our investigation.
Okay. All right. The report seems to be focused on just an assessment of what the utilities have done and how they performed, and was focused on that. What about our own self-assessment and what we might be able to do, not only from our own self-assessment of what we could do better, but from what other stakeholders may find that would help them, whether it's the utilities or the municipalities or other sister agencies, in doing a better job. Where is that self-assessment?
So that self-assessment was not included in the report. Obviously, the report looks at the performance of the utilities. I can't speak to, whether we'll be conducting a self-assessment, but ultimately, I think the report does take into account input from stakeholders, municipalities, and those interested customers who did voice their opinion, who were quite a few, and those comments did make its way into the report.
Okay. Thank you. But there's been no formal self-assessment to date.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Is anyone else aware of that?
There is nothing formal. I just wanted to point out that, of course, in any of these, we will be looking internally, at our processes and our staffing and our response. But we do have a new office which will focus on these events, the Office of Resilience and Emergency Preparedness. So I think we're always looking internally at anything we could do better, as well as, meetings that we've had with public officials and with the utilities, because, we're all in this together and we all play a part in preparedness and response.
Yeah. Thank you. I very much agree with that.
Commissioner, I would just add that informally, Office of Consumer Services has also been reviewing some of the lessons learned, and we're revisiting how we coordinate with the LSE customers and getting consistent data from the utilities and reporting of consistent LSE customer data, which is a primary concern for us.
Great. Thank you. Now, one of the questions I have relates to an entity that we have not talked about today, the New York Power Authority. And my understanding is, at least from public filings or public statements, they had a significant role in all of these storm recoveries, 2017 and 2018. So to the extent that when we're looking at investigations and reports, how do we incorporate external parties that we are not necessarily making mandated recommendations to, but their processes and performance may help or hinder, depending on the particular issue? How do we incorporate that in a way, whether it's our own self-assessment or the self-assessment of the utilities, but also what I see as that bucket of needing to assess those parties who are part of the process with us? How do we do that?
So again, NYPA is another party involved. One of the areas that we turn to NYPA for, the utilities turn to NYPA for, is providing some mutual assistance with some of their crewing. So we do reach out and talk to NYPA as well.
One of the things that I have concerns with is, to the extent that the utilities are engaging in arrangements with NYPA, especially because we are the ones under the law that ultimately have oversight of the utilities that are in our jurisdiction, as well as looking at it from any potential penalty violations or recommendations without penalty violations that would be incorporated into their plans. One of the concerns I have is making sure that the commission itself is very well aware of and embracing or not what those arrangements are in a way that may be helpful. So I say that understanding that there are arrangements that happen outside of the plan, but that we really need to make sure that we as the lead entity are the ones that are giving direction to the utilities, and also the ones that if we are to delegate that responsibility or direction, it's very clear what those chains of commands are, what those protocols are, and that we're not outside of that process. So what I said I was going to save my comments, but it did seem like an appropriate one to raise now. It's not at all meant to chill. In fact, it's meant to make sure that we're working together. And so I embrace that the New York Power Authority is very much engaged in this, but we need to be engaged as well in that process to make sure that we're not doing anything unintended consequences that are not helpful to our folks, especially the ones that will be on the ground. That's very important. It's very different sitting here versus being on the ground, and those processes and chains of commands are very important to understand. So I just raised that as something that's important to where I sit. One of the things that is not in this is what we have accomplished post Superstorm Sandy in terms of those items that have been done by the utilities and many times at the direction of the commission for such things as storm hardening and other that have been seen as helpful and also have come with costs attached to them as well. Where is the assessment of how those assets, whether it's whatever it happens to be, and all the different activities and actions that have taken place, how they have held up, and what is, from the accountability perspective, needing to either be changed or supports that those costs were worth it. I guess where does that come? Where do we do that analysis? It's not in the report, so.
So I think that analysis is done on a project-by-project basis. I wouldn't necessarily say that there is a one central focused report or overarching report that looks at all of those items. But I think we do look to continually refine what we consider to be success in those areas, and we continue to implement better and stronger projects as we go along. So I think we're constantly learning and analyzing and learning and taking that data and pushing that forward as we move into new resiliency projects.
Thank you. Out of these 18 primary recommendations, do we identify any, do we have these identified in order of magnitude?
Can you repeat your question again, Commissioner? I apologize.
So there's 18 primary recommendations, 94 sub-recommendations. Do we identify out of these 18 or 94, depending how we count, do we identify which ones rise to the level of most serious? Is there any kind of hierarchy of recommendations?
So the 18 primary recommendations, as you would call them, are 18 subject areas, I would say, that inform or categorize those 94 recommendations. The report does not list them in any kind of ranking order as such. I think staff would contend that they're all very important. That's why we're recommending them. But I think that it would be something that we can discuss with the utilities upon their filings as to how best to deal with such an issue.
Okay. I would just
also add that some of them have a very short-term implementation, not very difficult to implement, and as well as some of them are more longer-term. That'll take some time. For example, meeting with counties, sharing information, coordinating with counties, doing all that is not going to happen in a week.
Right.
So I think we're also looking at it from not just the impact it'll have, but how quickly you can actually resolve them and try to get as many in as we can.
I think that's actually a really helpful point, because to the extent that when we're looking at these recommendations, not only in terms of what the cost is, but also what takes a long time. So when we finally adopt these into the emergency response plans, they also may take time to ramp up, and we should be looking at what that means. So, for example, one of the questions I would then have is on the order to show cause today, but also from 2017, what ones, because remember the plans on an interim basis were adopted at the April 19th, 2018 session. There was an order approving plans on an interim basis. That happened, 2 more storms happened out of the 5 storms that were investigated. So looking at those 2, some of those violations or potential recommendations may logistically, feasibility-wise, not have been able to been implemented or not. Maybe they all could have. So it would be helpful when we're approving in the future the plans and also any recommendations that we also clearly establish what the expectation is for that timeline for them to actually be implemented. Because I think that also gives us, it gives us a clear understanding. If the utilities or other stakeholders that may be involved see that timeline is appropriate or not, they'd have an opportunity to say it. But also, we'd also be able to know clearly right after we adopt the plans, and if there was an unfortunate extreme weather event, we would also be able to know what we were looking at in terms of whether or not they should have had those in place, because some of them probably would not be. So it just gives us that further information. And since it would seem like in many times, I think before when we were adopting these plans, it would not have seemed like necessity. But since we adopted the plans in April 19th, 2018, and then had 2 more storms that became the subject of investigation just less than a month later, now I see that, to me, that would be important to know. And would also put us all on the same page of what we were looking at. Does that make sense? You could say if it doesn't make sense.
Well, I would certainly note that the order does take into account that we're asking the utilities to file a compliance timeline with recommendations that they're already in progress of implementing, so that would assist in those efforts. I think that we continue to work with the utilities in every major storm event to determine the gravity of the impacts, as well as where we are in those processes as far as the next iteration of their emergency response plans.
Out of these 18 primary recommendations, 94 sub-recommendations, how many of them have already been or indicated will be implemented? You seem to indicate that that was something that they were already doing. So I just want to make sure we understand what we're looking at in terms of the recommendations.
That's part of what the order seeks to get from the utilities, is an official reporting on that.
But we don't know, we haven't asked how many of these are already being done.
So again, I would probably say that we know that there's some paths that are very parallel to what we're recommending. They might not be in lockstep, however. So, for example, I know the utilities are very much trying to improve the processes for liaisons and getting them information, making sure they have access to better dashboards and information while they're out in the field or at a location. So I know a lot of that's already been happening. Whether it matches 100% with what we're looking for is, I think, what we're going to ask them to do. And then if there is a gap, we're going to close the gap.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the next steps on these plans, is it anticipated, excuse me, not on the plans, on this order to show cause, is it anticipated, not on the penalty section, but on the recommendations, is it anticipated that those recommendations, if adopted in some fashion by the utilities, agreed to, rejected, modified, whatever happens, whatever they happen to do, they have to come back to the commission for adoption? And how would that work?
So I think it would be twofold. I think part of the order to show cause would respond to the violation section as well, but we also have their ERP plans that would come before the commission as well. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach where we would then both entertain the recommendations and the filings from the utilities in the order to show cause proceeding, but as well as how they've been implemented in their ERPs in that proceeding as well.
Has anyone looked at the December 2018 emergency response plans that have currently been submitted and matched up these recommendations to see if they're already in there?
So we're currently going through our process of reviewing those plans, as well as determining whether or not these areas are in there. Some of the recommendations in our report, however, do not apply to the ERPs. They're outside of them. But in the cases that they are, we are going through as part of our analysis, which is another reason why you haven't seen the plans for your approval, around the normal time you would have normally.
Okay. All right. So there is, it's fair to say, at least to me, to say that there's now a delay in this while we work through this. Understandably, my concern is focusing on this while we also have to get moving forward on the approval of the plans, keeping in terms of we have scorecards, plans that need to be amended, these recommendations need to be gone through, and identifying which falls in that ERP and which doesn't, and also to the extent that there's a mismatch. Some of the mismatch may be that the December 2018 plans are actually potentially better than the recommendation, some of these recommendations that we are asking for and attaching an order to show cause from. So does seem like waiting, we had the plans and now we're bringing an order to show cause. It does seem like we could have done some engagement in terms of making sure we knew. What if they amend the plans and it goes to our recommendations, but it actually is diluting what the plan may have recommended? Will we work through that? Say we like your recommendation better than our recommendation?
So if the companies, during our discussions and review of what changes we'd like to make, are proposing something that meets our requirements or exceeds it based on what their capabilities are, we certainly would not throttle them back to our exact recommendation, but we want to make sure that they meet the baseline that we're trying to establish as part of our recommendation.
Okay. So in some of the analysis then that would come to us with the 2019 or 2018 plans in 2019 to approve, it'll be helpful to know if they meet or exceed the recommendations. And also it would be helpful to know, since a lot of these recommendations go across to all of the utilities, a sharing in some fashion that makes sense so that the ones that, especially the ones that exceed, might be looking at what that means to put into their plans, even if they meet our recommendations here, but someone else is exceeding it, and what that would look like.
Absolutely, and that's part of the activity that we've done in the past, is to try to show best practices from one plan to another company.
Okay, thanks. What are we doing to match up the 2018 State Energy Emergency Plan with the utilities plans and with what our actions are? If you don't know, that's fine.
Yeah, that's something that's fallen outside of our work in particular.
I think that's really important, especially since on some issues we're a lead agency, but also some we're not. And to the extent that we are identifying and looking at these plans, or making recommendations that may not match up or needs to be socialized with other stakeholders involved in the process, I do think that there is a need when we're issuing recommendations that we look at other things like the state energy emergency plan, but there are various other entities involved with their own processes, and some of that is helpful, but some of that is also, I think, causing confusion. So I would just flag it as something that is important to me when we look at our recommendations, that we fully know if there has to be any changes to, there may not be, but in case there's any changes that have to happen to the state energy emergency plan processes, that would be helpful to identify, and to the extent that those others are also, even if they're not formally, they should be, I would hope they would be, doing their own self-assessments as well, and to the extent that they're finding things that we could benefit from and the utilities could benefit from, it would be helpful to have that information. Okay. Were the same staff doing the investigations that were also part of the storm recovery processes and restoration processes?
There was some overlap.
How much overlap?
So myself, for example, is somebody who is both. Most of our, when we respond to a storm, it takes a sizable amount of staff. So we used those that were involved. Not all of them were the ones that were in the field, but without going back to look at the exact staff team to say who was deployed, who wasn't, I could get you that count, but I don't have it off the top of my head.
Okay. If you were to rewrite the legislation December 15th, 2018, in filing the plan, and you were asked what's the best date for the plans to be filed, knowing now our processes in terms of SAPA and getting engagement before the commission adopts it, and knowing that the same staff who's involved in the storm preparations and restorations, and also knowing that at the utilities, probably a lot of them are also, would you give a different date? And if so, what would be the date?
I'd certainly hesitate to supplant staff's thinking for the thinking of the legislature in that case.
But I was just going to add that, the difficulty is we don't know when a big storm is going to hit, and pretty much any date you pick has a chance of being right in the middle of an investigation.
So maybe you would ask,
or in some cases might just miss one, and right. What we just approved, we might find out a few days later doesn't work because of the lessons that we're learning during that response.
Right. Sounds to me like you maybe need some flexibility on that date.
I think this is a continuous improvement process. So regardless of where you are in the year, what storm event's going on, or if there's an investigation going on or not, we are working with the utilities all the time, just prior to events, during events, and after events, to look at lessons learned and to try to improve any preparation and response to those events.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you. Is there any question I have not asked that I should be asking? No? Now's your time. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to wait to give my comments.
Thank you. Commissioner Lisi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I'm looking at this large number of recommendations, and I'll just deal with the total number rather than breaking them down. But I really see this as an opportunity for improvement, based on a number of things, including what Commissioner Sayer said about what appears to be changing climate patterns, et cetera. But it is an outgrowth. The recommendations are an outgrowth of some large-scale failures that we have seen. Again, the large number of recommendations, I think, are a testament to the hard work and determination of the staff and the department. I'm sure it didn't come easily, so you're to be thanked for that, and I'll be supportive.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Leasley. So we will now move to the third item for discussion in this set of storm-related items. Item 304, Case 19E0288, which is in the matter of commencement of a judicial enforcement proceeding against New York State Electric and Gas Corporation, presented by Nicholas Forst, Assistant Counsel, still, and Christian Bondman, also still Chief of Electric Distribution Systems. He's available for questions. Nicholas, please begin.
Good morning, Chair Rhodes. Good morning, Commissioners. Item 304, the draft order before you directs the Council to the Commission to commence a special proceeding or action in New York State Supreme Court pursuant to Public Service Law Section 26 to prevent future violations of the Public Service Law, Commission regulations, and orders by the New York State Electric and Gas Corporation. Staff's 2018 winter and spring storm report identified a litany of storm-related issues, raising questions about NYSEG's emergency response and restoration performance for certain less central portions of its electric service territory, including the Brewster service area. Staff remains concerned with NYSEG's apparent continued inability to respond to storm events and, in turn, its poor restoration performance. Dating back to Superstorm Sandy and more recently during the 2017 windstorm, NYSEG has demonstrated that it is unable to respond and restore service to the satisfaction of its customers and governmental entities. NYSEG's inability is documented in various staff reports and commission orders and ultimately points to a pervasive pattern of inadequate response and restoration performance. The apparent inability to sufficiently improve the company's storm response and service restoration performance through implementation of and adherence to repeated directives by the Commission is, in staff's opinion, sufficient to warrant further Commission action. Staff's report identified numerous deficiencies in NYSEG's past emergency response and restoration efforts, which provide evidence of NYSEG's continued inability to satisfactorily adhere to the procedures and processes detailed in its ERP as approved by the Commission. It is this repeated noncompliance that supports the staff's recommendation to pursue further enforcement action to ensure compliance with the company's ERP, the ERP order, and Commission regulations. The Department and the Commission have regulatory authority to ensure that NYSEG provides safe and adequate service, which includes satisfactory emergency response and electric service outage restoration. The Public Service Law also authorizes the Commission, via its counsel, to seek judicial enforcement of the Commission's requirements. Pursuant to Public Service Law Section 26, the Commission may direct the Council to the Commission to commence enforcement proceedings in New York State Supreme Court. It is in the public interest for the Commission to direct the Council to the Commission to commence a special proceeding or action in New York State Supreme Court in the name of the Commission and the people of the State of New York to stop and prevent ongoing or future violations of Commission regulations and orders by NYSEG. The draft order before you this morning directs the Commission's counsel to commence a judicial enforcement action seeking to enjoin NYSEG from further violating the ERP order and Commission regulations concerning utility emergency response and restoration. This concludes my presentation. Christian Bonvin, John Sipos, and I are now available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just start with a couple of the points I've made consistently for the other two items. There are aspects of these storms and recovery response to them that we can control and others that we can't. And we're focused here on the items that are in our control. I find that this is an appropriate step to deliver accountability essentially to the customers of the state of New York. And it's appropriate in light of the especially noteworthy level of and steady pattern of issues that relate to NYSEG's response and preparation. Those are my comments. Commissioner Sayre.
My comments on the last item apply to this item as well. Here I think we're in the position of a blacksmith fixing a broken wheel. Sometimes you have to get out a bigger hammer.
Commissioner Berman.
So I have a couple of questions with this order itself and the language in the order. So this order has the same clause that has been utilized in Charter and American Water, I believe, pretty much verbatim. Counsel to the Commission shall commence a special proceeding or an action in the New York State Supreme Court in the name of the Commission and the people of the State of New York to stop and prevent ongoing or future violations by New York State Electric and Gas Corporation of Commission regulations and orders. Is that correct?
Good morning, Commissioner Berman. John Sipos. I believe that is correct. It's either similar or identical to.
Okay. Because the Commission, according to the order, determines it's in the public interest for the Council, to the Commission, to commence a special proceeding or an action in New York State Supreme Court pursuant to Public Service Law Section 26. That's different. Public Service Law Section 26 to stop and prevent ongoing or future violations of the PSL and Commission regulations and orders by NYSEG. So, looking at this, there's then an actual other clause here that says, going forward, the Commission may also separately consider other potential pathways and measures to protect ratepayers and deter unsatisfactory performance by NYSEG, as well as determine whether certain costs should be borne by NYSEG shareholders. I guess my question is, and my confusion lies in, what are we asking the court to do exactly?
So this order would authorize counsel to the Commission, to the Office of General Counsel, to bring a civil action in Albany County Supreme Court seeking injunctive relief to compel compliance with Commission orders and with the underlying plans. It seeks an affirmative injunctive order requiring compliance. And that is within the scope of Public Service Law Section 26.
So we're asking the court to tell the utilities they have to follow our orders. This order and any future order.
So there is an existing order, and it would seek compliance with that. And depending on how the litigation could go, if the litigation was authorized, it could seek future compliance as well. It need not. I mean, that is all part of the details of how that case might work out.
Okay, we'll get
But
back to the
there
details
is-
in a minute. But
we are seeking it. The order, or the order before the commissioners, would authorize counsel to seek a court order compelling compliance with this commission's orders.
okay, so you said there's an existing order. That's the one that we haven't voted on yet?
No, I was referring to underlying commission orders regarding emergency response plans.
The orders adopting the emergency response plans?
Yes. As well as the plans themselves.
From as far back as when?
It would go back to 2017,
to
if
2017.
If not before. I mean, we would look at the plans.
Right.
We would determine the violations, and we would seek to compel compliance with the aspects of those plans.
We're going back on, so we have today, I just want to make sure I
Well,
understand this. We have, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
There is an existing order. There are existing orders regarding emergency response plans, and there could be an order at some point in the future regarding other aspects of emergency response plans.
And we want the court to tell them to listen to us.
To comply with commission orders, yes.
Okay. I'm not sure I understand, and it may be me, but I think our commission orders should speak for themselves, and any utility that's under our jurisdiction that fails to take into account our orders in an appropriate way, we should be discussing what that means. Now, I don't want to water down anything, and I understand the hammer reference, and I think that was a good one. But I've also tried to hang pictures, and sometimes I've used a hammer and I've broken the picture. So sometimes we need to look at what we're doing and whether or not that power that we have is one that we fully understand before we swing that hammer. So let me ask you, you said there are details in the action that may come. Is there a petition or a complaint or something that we have to look at in what exactly you're going to go forward and say to the court?
No, as of today, we do not have a draft complaint prepared. We are, the staff and the department are seeking authorization from the commission
Right.
to commence such a proceeding, to go forward, to start it.
So if the history is right in looking at the other two, which were supposed to be unique situations in the other two matters where we've done similar things, you very soon after go into settlement discussions that take place outside of our normal commission processes. Is there an anticipation that there will be settlement discussions?
So I can't say that there would not be. It's settlement discussions are a possibility in litigation, but so is driving forward to seek compliance with the judicial process.
Okay. Who's your principal when you do this?
So, as counsel to the commission, my principals are the commissioners. This order is under the auspices of Section 26. It seeks the authorization from the commissioners and from the commission for a green light to start with the process. There is also, that's under Section 26 of the Public Service Law. There's also Section 12, which provides that counsel, at the direction of the chair of the commission, shall prosecute litigation.
But this one is under Public Service Law Section 26, which is the commission is given by the legislature to require utilities to provide, to give you the, so explain to me, let's just take a step back. Explain to me, Public Service Law Section 26 gives the commission itself the authority to tell you to do this.
That is correct.
Okay. So while I know you reference Public Service Law Section 12, I don't think you meant to then suggest that when you go to the judicial proceeding, that your principles change from the commission itself to then the chair by referencing Section 12.
What I was suggesting is that under Section 12, with respect to day-to-day litigation matters, the chair has authorization under Section 12 of the Public Service Law.
So similar to when our secretary to the commission has given certain ministerial attributes to decide whether to extend the time period. Here, the full weight of the commission, not only from the Public Service Law Section 26, but from this order, is giving you that authority. So unless we know clearly, so I'm just trying to get at whether or not the commission itself will be involved in, not just briefed after the fact or during, exactly how much, since we're your principals, not only because you're the counsel to the commission, but under Section 26 and this order, the commission itself is giving you that authority. To the extent that when you go there and you're engaged in not just day-to-day filing, but the actual substantive work that may include litigation, and it may include settlement, and it may include other things, your principals are still the commission itself. Is that fair to say?
That is, the commission would have, under that scenario that you provided, would have authorized the commencement of the case. However, there is also provision in Section 12 of the Public Service Law for the counsel to commence and prosecute. And if there is an authorization to commence a case, then it is also the responsibility of the counsel to prosecute that case going forward, and that is provided under Section 12 to be done under the direction of the chair of the commission.
So
there's a whole...
There's actually ambiguity thank you, in that section. So I understand that we've taken some liberties in what that Section 12 means, and I do understand that we've gone further than it has been done before in many ways. I'm very, very focused on the delegation of duties to staff and to counsel to the commission. As counsel to the commission, this order is coming to us as Public Service Law Section 26. I understand you put in a footnote to Section 12, which I think is the cliffhanger, in whether or not the commission itself are your principals, which they will be, regardless of whether you take direction from the chair. But to the extent you still need to keep in mind that you're acting on, the chair is acting on behalf of the commission, and the counsel to the commission is acting on behalf of all of your principals, whatever that happens to be. In this case, it's 4 right now. So to the extent that settlement discussions or litigation is happening, there needs to be a lot more robust communication and getting authority from the commission itself to the extent that your principals are interested in being involved. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. It's also fair to say that I understand that, and it has also been my practice to make sure that commissioners are kept up to date with aspects of litigation, significant aspects.
Up to date and involved are 2 different things. So I would very much look at this order, Public Service Law Section 26, however I vote, even if my vote doesn't carry, that the authority and weight of this includes the commission body, even that commissioner 1 or 2 who may dissent from this. So to the extent that when you look at this order and going forward, your counsel to the commission and you're moving forward on Public Service Law Section 26 on behalf of the commission, not only from that section, but also from the order itself. In here, is there an anticipation that the petition will be drafted and we'll be approving that?
Well, there are at a formal commission hearing. Is that what you are asking?
I'm asking what the next
Because
steps are.
there would be, if that's the question. I mean, I would suggest, without getting into it in too much detail right now, that there could be, potential open meetings law issues like that. But and I think that is part of what Section 12 goes to, that the council, at the direction of the chair, commences and prosecutes. I certainly, I believe that I and the Office of Counsel, endeavor to be as collegial as possible.
So I would just say,
Just if I may for a moment, the council commences at the direction of the commission
That's correct.
and then prosecutes at the direction of the chair.
That is correct.
well, I think I need to see Public Service Law Section 26 for a moment. This is a huge issue, not just with here, but going forward. And there's not a lot of clarity on what we're doing, not only here, but even in terms of the process. Public Service Law Section 12 references you as the counsel to the commission and gives you some authority at the direction of the chair. That, too, is not clear on what that is. I would actually say it's the direction of the chair on behalf of the commission, and it's for ministerial, in many ways, ministerial matters, so that you can appear without having to get all four of us or five to say, is it okay if I appear? So some of that ministerial day-to-day activity, I understand. But when then you're referencing Public Service Law Section 26, which is clearly specific to what we're being asked to vote on, you can't then flip to Section 12 to get around that the commission as a body is your principles. I know I'm a difficult client. I get that. But I also think that there's a need for us to clearly understand what we're substantively asking you to do. This order doesn't give us any substance or even exactly what your next steps are. There's no petition attached. We're not in an executive session to discuss the litigation or anything else. So I understand your reference to open meetings law. I don't want to violate the open meetings law at all. But there's nothing confidential attached to this even for us to look at. So I'm basically giving you blank authority, or we would be blank authority, to go to the court and say, we want this utility to be told to listen to our orders, whatever they may be. Now, there's a reference in here. There's a reference in here that says, essentially, that part of the reason we're doing this is because, let me just make sure I get to the right section, talking about Hurricane Sandy as well as the 2017 storm. So we're going back all the way to Superstorm Sandy. So today it's NYSEG. Next month, if there's a storm and another utility is been determined to be significantly in violation or not, we haven't acted on that, or in order to show cause is not taking is not actually deciding that. We're just listening to staff and asking the utilities to say that. So if we do that, each and every utility, we can be going back to Superstorm Sandy and revisiting all of that. So I'm just confused because I want to know clearly, and from a liability perspective and from investment perspectives as well as customers, how far back are we going? And so therefore, are we actually going to potentially chill any movement? Because if they're tied to potentially going back as far back as Superstorm Sandy, we need to get under the hood more on what that means.
So, Commissioner Berman, the reference to Superstorm Sandy and the 2017 storm as well as the staff's 2018 storm report, were intended as part of this presentation to provide a basis for the Commission to include in its consideration of this, that there actually has been something of a track record here with this utility, and that is a basis. It's a basis for the Commission, if the Commission so decides and so votes, to authorize council to go to seek injunctive relief. It's not just a single event. It's not just two events. There's actually a continuum that has occurred and that has befallen here.
I honestly am very confused and dumbfounded by what exactly this means, because if we're saying that dating back to Superstorm Sandy and more recently the 2017 windstorm, NYSEG's inability to respond and restore service to the satisfaction of its customers, governmental entities, and the Commission, and we're only getting to this now in 2019 to showcase that we have a problem, that doesn't make sense to me. And there were issues in other areas from Superstorm Sandy and other storms that we didn't then go for judicial enforcement of future proceedings and reference back other ones. So if we're going to be going back to that, why are we adopting a settlement in the 2017 storm?
So this reference that we're having a discussion about goes to potential evidence and goes to potential considerations that the Commission may take into account as it reviews the proposed order today. It's not. I'll leave it at that.
May I? So my understanding, and I'm probably the least legally trained person in the room, is that Section 26 was there, and its intent and its language relate to the possibility that a utility may not follow an order. And for those, if that contemplated possibility comes to pass, that there is an ability to go get further enforcement authority. And my understanding with that understanding of Section 26 is that the track record here rises to the level where the not following of an order is no longer just a theoretical possibility, but has some basis in the evidence. So I'm not sure. I think your fear is that we're going to go and sanction a utility for failures back in 2011, right? Superstorm Sandy, 10? 12. But that's not what I read this order as doing, nor do I understand that as the position the council's proposing.
Thank you. That was helpful. The order doesn't tell you that, and the petition itself doesn't tell you that. The order says, dating back to Superstorm Sandy and more recently the 2017 windstorm, NYSEG's inability to respond and restore service to the satisfaction of its customers, governmental entities, and the Commission is well documented and demonstrates a pervasive pattern of inadequate response and restoration performance. We're going to use the evidence from Superstorm Sandy and 2017, which, by the way, the settlement does not say that they did anything wrong. So we're using that evidence that's potentially stale and potentially something that when they agreed to settle, they were not expecting to now be utilized against them here to prove evidence that they have a pervasive pattern of inadequate response and restoration performance. That may or may not be the case, but we as the Commission waited till now to tell them that and put them on notice. So I guess I go back to why the 2017 settlement JP and the investment JP happened in May 18th, 2000 and, I'm sorry, let me look, 18. Okay. There were 4 storms in 2018 that were subject, there were 5 storms, but there were 4 storms that were then part of that, right? When was the last 5th storm in 2018 that's subject to?
So the 2018 investigation included 5 storms. Winter and Quinn kind of get pushed together a lot, so that it actually looks like 4. When you
Right.
And when was the last of
one?
those?
May 15th.
May 15th. And we had a settlement JP and an investment JP May 18th, 2018, correct? So we had that information, but there was no asterisk by the way, we may bring a Public Service Law Section 26 order against you, asking the court to tell you to listen to our orders and any future orders. Why are we today, why would we, if we have an issue with their pervasive lack of response, why would we say in the settlement and in here that we're good with things? Plus, we're not factoring in other storms that's happened since then that my understanding is NYSEG got credit for doing well. So I'm just trying to figure out what the disconnect is here, because you're going to the court on behalf of the commission and you're going to use evidence on Superstorm Sandy and 2017, but our 2017 storm is potentially being settled, and there was we agreed that no one was saying that they did anything wrong, and that's part of the settlement.
Can I just clarify something, Commissioner? The settlement under item 301 is an agreement to provide recommendations to the Commission to accept the proposed settlement. The settlement relates to potential liability under the auspices of an action brought under 25A
Okay,
for penalties.
You're right. That's
so
very
this
good
is a
clarification.
key distinction between that and the injunctive relief being sought in the item currently before the Commission.
Yeah, thank you, because that even makes my argument or my analysis actually better, because they accept it. So there's no pervasive disregard for the commission order because they agreed to the recommendation. So every utility on the order to show causes before us today on the 302 would be mindful that at some point in another future storm, they may wind up having this evidence used against them in a way that doesn't make sense. If maybe I'm missing something, but I think that we would do well to rethink bringing forth an order asking the court to tell the utility to listen to us when we're not even sure what we're listening to ourselves. And maybe it's better for us to have engagement and look at whatever that petition might look like, as well as the exhibits to the evidence that would be there. Because part of the issue for me is that these reports are a snapshot. So it doesn't talk about the hardening of the assets. It doesn't talk about all of the really good things that may also tell a story about what we've done to fortify the grid and what the utilities have done. And yet we're focusing on, and the recommendations to help, everything is about lessons learning, right? Whether our own self-assessment. So we're really basically saying, if you do well, you're okay. If you have some challenges, we may decide that we're going to come back at you. And I'm not really sure, I'm not really sure whether this actually will produce effective changes to help us in our future reliability and resiliency of the grid in a way that actually is going to be helpful.
Well, I would respectfully suggest that it could and it likely will. Section 26 is one of the tools that the Commission has. It's a tool that the legislature gave to the Commission. It is a powerful tool. You're absolutely correct about that. It's a tool that requires judicious use. And I think that the track record here that we have discussed is sufficient to propose this order to the Commission. Given the track record, it is appropriate to go and use this tool that the legislature has provided that has been with the Public Service Commission for decades, and to now use it in this situation to obtain additional enforcement power to ensure compliance going forward.
I'm disappointed to hear you say that. It undermines the Commission.
No, I didn't say it undermines. I'm sorry.
No,
if,
you didn't
if
say
I
that.
said that, I misspoke. I
No,
did
you
not
didn't
mean
say that.
to say
I'm
that.
saying your thinking, for me, undermines the Commission authority. The Commission's orders are very important. And if we're going to do Public Service Law Section 26, I think you need to have an order that actually is very specific about what evidence we're bringing forward. So a reference to Hurricane Sandy and a reference to the 2017 storm without actually any specifics, you're not referencing the plans, but they go back to, I think you said 2017, even though the plans have been in existence. But so what I hear now is 2017 plans are included, evidence of things that happened in Hurricane Sandy, evidence that happened from 2017, and that those things are all going to be included in some way in a petition that is going to ask the court to tell the company to listen to us now and whatever future things we may do. And the injunctive relief is something we could do on our own anyway, but somehow we're going to get the court to bless that. Now, I'm a parent of 2 children, and I've been very focused on working in having a very collaborative process in how I raise my children with my husband. I don't say to my children that I'm going to tell Daddy to tell you to listen to me. I may engage with my husband, I may work on it, but I find this to be just as dismissive of the Commission as if it was that I was saying to my children, Daddy's going to tell you that you should listen to Mommy. I don't get it. So I would go back a step and say, what is it that we're trying to do? We're trying to drive behavioral changes that we see as problematic, and we want to capture what that means to make course corrections in a way that helps us not only as we regulate, but helps the utility. And yet we haven't yet in here, in this order to show cause, nor, by the way, the 2017 one, which we brought an order to show cause, we never said that they were not being responsive. They adopted those recommendations. They worked out that, and we never said, you're not listening to us. In fact, they did listen to us because they made those changes. Now, they may not have implemented them effectively, and we may need to look at that. But I'm just trying to get understanding exactly. And so this most recent one, we have not, this order, the order to show cause for 302, is not, it's very clear in the language that we are not saying that any of the utilities did anything wrong. Though we do reference that we're going to potentially bring penalty violations against each and every one of them, not just NYSEG, except for PSC&G Long Island, who doesn't have that doesn't have that. We don't have that teeth. So I'm just trying to understand, for you as counsel to the commission, when you leave here today, what actually we're asking you to do, except to take this order and say, please tell them to listen to us.
Well, I would characterize it a different way. It is seeking an affirmative, this order, should the commission grant it, I want to be clear about that. This order would authorize council to seek an affirmative judicial order requiring compliance. It is a tool that the commissioners have as part of their enforcement and their compliance toolbox. It is, I respectfully suggest it's a significant tool. And I guess I would also add, having had some experience before I came here with other state agencies, that other state agencies also, from time to time, seek civil enforcement action in states in New York State Supreme Court.
So
I
your
see
reference
this
is
as,
to the Attorney General?
well, on behalf of various other agencies. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but from time to time, state agencies in the state of New York seeks injunctive relief in state Supreme Court. There are several examples of that.
All right. I very much think we need to think very clearly about the tools in the toolbox and whether or not we are appropriately using them in a way that is helpful, not disruptive, and also at the same time remembering who owns that toolbox and who gets to decide the use of that and then how much is used and when. This order is very open-ended and very concerning. And when we first moved on the American Water one, so we only have two other examples of this that is my history that I know. Don't know if there are others. But at least in my time, is the American Water one and Charter. Charter I wasn't a part of. And I am concerned that both of those were seen as unique situational ones that demanded that. And now here we have in a very short time a third one that again gives no more clarity than the others. And I hope that the process that was done in both of those is not continued. Here it's different because this is a little bit more reference to the Public Service Law Section 26, and we're talking about it here as the primary vehicle and reminding you that your principles are the commission as a body. I do think we need to take a harder look at what we're trying to achieve, because I'm very afraid that we're moving in a direction that becomes one that's chilling rather than one that is working with all stakeholders. Tammy referenced in her comments about during storm recovery and preparations, the importance of working with all stakeholders. I very much support that. But it also means after the event, working together and figuring it out. And to the extent that we've seen a track record where these settlements then are just between staff and the companies in a way that is not necessarily focused on appropriate next steps, but rather on figuring out a dollar figure. One, we need to see what the costs, the real costs are before we even look at the penalties, and we need to see from those costs. So when you're looking at it, what's the dollar figure attached to that as well? Because it's not just about the penalty amount, it's about the dollar figures. If the costs if you're settling for less than the cost of some of these recommendations that you think have been flagrantly violated, well, that's different. We need to look at that. And also looking at whether these recommendations, if they had all been implemented, would that have prevented the outages? No. How much would have been prevented? How much earlier would it have happened? For each one, what is the forecast looking backwards at what that would have done? I don't know the answer to any of that. It's disappointing. But I do think that you are very focused on your role as counsel to the commission, and I do very much appreciate your concern as it relates to your role. I just don't think that it's appropriate for us to delegate such authority without fully understanding the ramifications of that, and also worrying about the next steps. We got to get back to the business of doing what we need to do to be prepared for the next storm. Okay.
So, Commissioner Berman, a question to you. As we went through the prior items, you indicated that you'd be reserving some of the comment for the end.
Reach the end.
Well, ordinarily we'd proceed to calling the vote, and I want to respect your your ability to make the comments you'd like, and so if now's a good time.
Yes, I think
okay.
we need to. Commissioner Alisi, if he wants to say anything on this item.
I'm so sorry. Commissioner Alisi. Nothing to add. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Thank you.
Thank you. So Hurricane Sandy reinforced the importance of reliability and resiliency in New York. After Superstorm Sandy, the state amended commission statutes to address the electric emergency plans and to increase our oversight and enforcement role with respect to the plans. In fact, the amended rules specified certain subject areas to be included in the electric emergency plans. And the electric emergency plans always were included before Superstorm Sandy, but it was the first time that the Commission was now adopting them after Superstorm Sandy. And also, we were focused on certain newer subject areas, and we're requiring utilities now to file them. They would then be SAP'd, and the Commission would adopt them and approve them, and they were filed on or before December 15th of each year. Commission staff would review them, then approve them. There was an order to show cause brought from the March 2017 storm, and it was the first time that we were looking at that and issuing it after Superstorm Sandy. The companies responded, and then it led to the next phase, and it led to a penalty action, and then there was from that a settlement. Really, it leads me to the critical issue of how to incorporate into our emergency plans and into utility emergency plans what lessons can be learned. Again, March 2017 was the first storm that rose to the level of a storm after Superstorm Sandy that required this type of review for us. Not only is it just from the lessons from a storm, but it's lessons learning, not lessons learned. We have to look at the impacted areas. How can we take those lessons learning and incorporate them in a way that makes significant changes, if necessary? The plans themselves were supposed to be live working documents that help tell a story, so that it's before, during, and after that we need to make sure we understand and have robust emergency plans that work, and then after the fact look at it to implement and make corrective changes as needed and as appropriate. Each event is different, So we need to take that into account, what we're learning. There's no one perfect way to be an energy regulator. However, an active openness to continuous learning and improving are critical. A good energy regulator recognizes the need for independence, true transparency, investor-consumer protections, instilling public confidence, and being forward-thinking while understanding the history of what got us here. Actively engaged regulators must be focused on both the historical and present context of our energy regulations. Doing so can help shape and understand our desired future energy needs and can help define short and long-term economically sound solutions, encourage true sustainable innovation, ensure continuous drive to improve reliability and resiliency of the grid, and foster productivity growth. Regulators can and must strive to do this through timely, sensible, and thoughtful regulatory approval processes, with decisions that give clarity and certainty, while also allowing some level of flexibility so as not to become stagnant and stale. It is not enough for us to pat ourselves on the back and say, we have the power, we designed well rules and regulations, so you're mandated to follow them. Instead, and then thus we've said we've succeeded. Look, we've produced good regulatory outcomes because we drove them to do X. We have to be better than that. We must be mindful of our regulatory powers and focus on using judiciously and as appropriate our powers. We can't just be reactive. We're supposed to be developing policies and helping to set up frameworks to implement so that we truly are moving forward in a way that has long-lasting soundness. In the aftermath of any storm event, there are always going to be questions. No amount of preparedness can eliminate completely outages in extreme weather events. Our focus is on working to reduce and shorten them. We look at storm preparation, restoration processes, coordination with local government and public outreach and others. Our focus has to be on accountability. It has to be on how to align with others, how to be accessible, how to have things accessible and affordable. Primarily when we moved forward with REV, when we began it, we made a promise to bring improved reliability and resiliency to our state grid. We must be mindful of looking at that and what that means. Our analysis must be focused on that. I very much understand the desire to point fingers. I very much understand the desire at times to do that. And also to hold people accountable and entities accountable when they fail to perform and they should have performed. We must do better. We must continue to do better. When I look at 301 in isolation, I could say yes, I concur, I agree with that. But then when we move on to 302 and 304, the orders to show cause on the 2018 storms, and then 304, which is an order directing us to giving you authority to go to court to say, tell them to listen to us, I have to take a pause. I don't understand why we are adopting and approving 301 at the same time that we're saying 302, we're giving an order to show cause, and then we're moving into 304. It seems like a disconnect. At the same time, we have another item on session, which is 382. And in that case, in 382, there was a discrete issue with vegetative right-of-way management for NYSEG. And there was a discrete issue, came to light, and staff and the utility worked together. There was no order to show cause. There was no threat of penalty actions. There was no threat of an order to go to court. They worked together. They came up with it. And then they said, we'd like you to bless this because it's important, especially in the upcoming season. And we've entered into this consent, and we'd like you to say yes. And we're doing it here. So what I see is a disconnect in what our processes are. Now, I do believe that we have enforcement powers. I think that's a good thing. But I think we need to be mindful of when we use that and how we're using it, and to give regulatory certainty not only to the utilities, but to those other engaged stakeholders, and direction to staff, because it will be harmful to us if we do not take the time to get under the hood and see what we're doing. What is the metric that gets us to an enforcement proceeding that may take you into court? What is the metric that gets you into an enforcement proceeding that may not take you into court but give you, subject you to penalty violations? We need to be careful, and we need to look at that, especially as we're looking to every year update these plans, because it's going to have a chilling effect, not only on the utilities, but the stakeholders, because these plans are supposed to be live working documents helping. If they're going to have to look at that and assign now a litigation risk to each and every one, we all need to be mindful of what that is. Now, we also, in one item, which I don't have before me, we address the fact that there are costs associated and resources associated with Section 25 and 25A. And therefore, I think it might be 382, the language in there, which is why we're okay with doing it outside of 25 and 25A. So it's really food for thought. I don't believe I'm going to be able to convince my fellow commissioners, but I think we need to really figure out what it is that we're doing in a way that gives clear direction on the next steps. I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and work with all of us on doing that. I'm not comfortable with delegating to you with broad parameters without any real specifics on what you're actually being asked to do. It puts you in a bad position, because then you have this disconnect between Public Service Law 26 and Public Service Law 12. I would focus very much on the fact that you're counsel to the Commission, and therefore, as to substantive issues, it's very important that the Commission itself, especially under Public Service Law 26, has to move together in a way that produces a regulatory certainty and stability that helps us in what we're doing to have safe and reliable service. It's too important, our role, and it's too important to the people in the state who need to rely on us to have this oversight role. So the one thing that is really striking to me out of all things is the failure for us to have done a benefit cost analysis on these recommendations. That information is very important to me, especially being an economic regulator. This complex focus and transition in our energy future and our energy grid, it needs to be managed in an orderly way with a focus on community and customer expectations about their essential services. We need to have that engagement. There's work to be done, and we should be doing it together. We can do it better together. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you for those very thoughtful comments. Commissioner Sayre and Commissioner Lisi, anything you want to? Thank you. So with that, we will. I will move to call for a vote. First on item 301, case 17E0594. My vote is in favor of the recommendations adopted in terms of the joint proposals as discussed. Commissioner Sayre, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
I concur with reservation.
Commissioner Lisi, how do you vote?
Aye.
The item is approved and the recommendation is adopted. We move now to a vote on item 302B, cases 19E0105 et al. My vote is in favor of the recommendations to direct each utility to show cause why the utility should not implement staff's recommendations and to show cause why the Commission should not pursue a penalty action as discussed. Commissioner Sayre, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Lisi, how do you vote? Aye. Sorry, Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
No, without prejudice. I'd like to first hear from the utilities and make determination based on that. So no, without prejudice.
And Secretary, I seem to be dropping the ball repeatedly today. Did I vote on item 301?
You voted no.
Yes, you did.
Well, in that case, I'm going to make sure I vote on item 302. And so I vote in favor of the recommendation. Now I'll proceed to call for a vote on item 304, case 19E0288. My vote is in favor of the recommendation to direct counsel to the Commission to commence a special proceeding or action in New York State Supreme Court as discussed. Commissioner Sayre, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
No.
Commissioner Alisi, how do you vote? Aye. The item is approved and recommendations are adopted. So we now come to the fourth item for discussion, which is item 303, case 15E0751, as it relates to value stack compensation presented by Ted Kelly, Assistant Counsel. Warren Myers, Director, Office of Market and Regulatory Economics, and Marco Padula, Director of Markets and Innovation, are available for questions. May I go off book for just a second? I'm mindful that we've been at this for a while. Do people need a recess for a minute or two, or shall we just keep working through the agenda? The default is we keep working. All right, Ted, take a seat.
Good afternoon, Chair Rhodes and Commissioners. Item 303 is a draft order adopting modifications to the value stack and value of distributed energy resources policy for new distributed generation projects going forward, as well as certain projects in development. The Value of Distributed Energy Resources, or VDER, transition order issued in March 2017 directed transition of compensation for distributed generation from net metering to the value stack, which bases compensation on the actual calculable benefits that the distributed energy resources, or DERs, create. DERs subject to the value stack receive compensation for the energy they inject into the utility system for a set of values calculated based on the utility costs they offset. The energy value, based on the energy commodity purchase requirements offset by each kilowatt hour injected. The capacity value, based on the installed capacity, or ICAP, purchase requirements offset by injections. The environmental value, based on the renewable energy credit, or REC, compliance costs offset by each kilowatt hour injection. The demand reduction value, or DRV, based on the distribution costs offset by injections, averaged across each utility service territory. And the locational system value, or LSRV, available only in locations that the utility has identified as having having specific high needs that can be addressed by DERs, and based on the higher specific distribution costs offset by injections in that area. The transition order also established a number of transitional mechanisms to moderate the changeover from net energy metering to the value stack for various customer classes and project types, including Phase 1 net energy metering, which includes a limited continuation of net metering style compensation for certain projects, and the Market Transition Credit, or the MTC, which is an adder that allows the value stack to approach the previous level of compensation under net metering in a declining block fashion. The transition order was followed by the implementation order, in September 2017, which provided the details necessary to produce actual effective tariffs based on the value stack compensation method developed in the implementation order, or the transition orders. Following the implementation of the value stack, New York State has experienced robust DER development, including a record year for solar photovoltaic deployment in 2018 and enough projects currently in development to double statewide distributed solar capacity. However, the Commission acknowledged in the transition order and implementation order that the value stack as established was an initial transitional compensation mechanism and would require further development. The transition order directed staff to convene a process to work on improvements to the value stack. A number of stakeholders raised concerns about certain elements of the value stack and recommended modifications, both within the value stack working group established by staff and through other forums. In response to those concerns, and as the culmination of a multi-year stakeholder process that included working group meetings, presentations, exchanges of proposals, and multiple rounds of written comments, staff released a set of white papers recommending modifications to certain aspects of the value stack and VDER policy. The proposed order addresses recommendations from 2 white papers released in December 2018, the white paper regarding future value stack compensation, including for avoided distribution costs, and the white paper regarding capacity value compensation. The decisions in the draft order reflect the robust comments filed by stakeholders on these white papers. I will summarize the major decisions in the draft order which adopt, modify, or reject recommendations from the white papers. First, the draft order initiates a proceeding to examine utility marginal cost of service studies and directs staff to develop and issue a work plan and schedule for the proceeding. The MCOS studies, which are used to determine distribution system and locational values, are important not only to the value stack, but also to a number of other aspects of planning and valuation in the dynamically evolving utility systems under the Reforming the Energy Vision proceeding. Unfortunately, there has not been sufficient opportunity for meaningful external review of new approaches adopted by utilities in those studies, or sufficient consideration of the differences between approaches by different utilities. Value stack compensation based on MCOS studies will not be modified based on new studies until this proceeding is complete and results in Commission-approved methodologies and studies at each utility. Second, the draft order rejects staff's recommendation that the locational system relief value be eliminated. A number of commenters, including the utilities, solar and storage developers, and environmental nonprofits, expressed concern regarding this recommendation. As the draft order explains, while issues may exist with the current methodology, the development of locational price signals is an important component of VDER, and the alternatives discussed by staff, including demand response programs and non-wires alternatives, do not sufficiently meet the need to reflect specific locational values for distributed generation projects. To maintain alignment of the LSRV with actual system needs, while increasing project owners' ability to predict and manage LSRV compensation, the order directs that the LSRV be modified to a call system similar to demand response programs where projects are compensated based on their performance during utility calls. Third, several changes are made related to the demand reduction value. Staff had recommended certain modifications to the overall dollar per kilowatt year value. Those changes are not adopted because they were based on the elimination of the LSRV, which was not adopted. However, the method of providing that compensation is modified to divide the dollar per kilowatt year value by a number of hours reflecting the likely peak hours in each relevant system. For most utilities, those hours are 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. on non-holiday weekdays from June 24th to September 15th. For NYSEG, certain hours during January are also included, reflecting higher winter usage in NYSEG compared to its peak. And for Con Edison, the hours are based on previously established areas, generally covering summer mornings, summer afternoons, or summer evenings based on what local peaks are in each of the 4 previously established areas. Previously, the DRV dollar per kilowatt year value was locked in for a project for 3 years. The staff proposal recommended moving to a system where the overall value is updated for all projects every 2 years, but with changes limited to 5% in each 2-year update. However, as commenters note, the MCOS proceeding could result in substantial changes, upwards or downwards, to this value, such that the 5% limit significantly hinders sending meaningful price signals. Therefore, that is not adopted. Rather, the DRV will be locked in for each project for 10 years, but will be updated for new projects once the MCOS proceeding is finished and based on a schedule of new MCOS studies in the future following that. Fourth, the draft order adopts staff's recommendation that Phase 1 net energy metering eligibility be offered to on-site commercial projects that receive demand charges with a rated capacity of 750 kilowatts or smaller and designed solely to offset on-site load. The Commission finds that due to these customers paying demand charges for the majority of their delivery costs, or in some cases the entirety of their delivery costs, this will have no meaningful cost impact on non-participating customers and will offer a simple option to commercial customers who wish to use distributed generation solely to serve their own electric needs. Fifth, the draft order adopts staff's recommendation to move from the market transition credit to a new community credit in NYSEG, RG&E, and National Grid. The draft order also finds that moving to a community credit in Con Edison is beneficial and appropriate, and therefore directs a move to a community credit there, which is it's different than what staff had recommended. Transitioning to a community credit, which will be provided to all CDG subscribers rather than only mass market customers, and will not prevent receipt of the demand reduction value as the MTC did, allows the funding of more projects at the same or lower costs, with the 2% net revenue impact target at each utility maintained. And it allows this by leveraging the potential for cheaper financing due to the presence of large anchor customers, and by including the locational and time-varying incentive of the demand reduction value. It also enables tenants in master metered buildings to subscribe to community distributed generation projects under the same terms as direct metered ratepayers, which was not previously possible. The draft order rejects staff's recommendation that a community credit also be applied to large commercial customers in projects that currently receive a market transition credit, finding that the recommendation does not sufficiently demonstrate that this will result in lower costs for non-participating ratepayers. Sixth, the draft order adopts staff's recommendation to replace the market transition credit at Orange and Rockland and Central Hudson with an upfront community adder funded by previously collected uncommitted ratepayer funds held by the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. This will encourage continued development in those areas without imposing a further impact on customers in service territories where the 2% target has already been reached. Moving forward, as community credit availability is exhausted, and to the extent that the above value stack compensation continues to be needed to ensure robust development of CDG projects in various parts of the state, it would be appropriate to consider extending this incentive to other projects in other utility territories, not once they are no longer receiving an MTC or community credit, as well as to extend its availability further in Central Hudson and O&R if and when that is exhausted. However, any such extension would require further commission consideration and in particular of funding source and incentive levels. So it would require a future proposal followed by opportunities for comment and then action by the commission. Seventh, the draft order adopts staff's proposed changes to the capacity value calculations with some modifications. The changes result in capacity value being calculated in a transparent manner using publicly available New York Independent System Operator capacity prices rather than, as they currently are, based on somewhat opaque utility tariff calculations. They also increase the alignment of those values with actual utility capacity costs from reflecting utility purchases from the Independent System Operator. Several commenters identified errors in staff proposals, and those errors are corrected in the draft order. The decisions made in the draft order continue the evolution of VDER tariffs as an effective compensation mechanisms for DERs in New York. The draft order is particularly timely as a number of developers with projects in early stages of development are waiting for commission decision on the staff white papers before making final investment decisions. These changes, and in particular the availability of the community credit and community adder, will provide for more than 1,000 megawatts or 1 gigawatt of additional CDG development in New York State, on top of the more than 500 megawatts of CDG already qualified under the value stack, and on top of projects in development and expected to be developed under remote crediting and on-site generation rather than CDG. This represents a meaningful step towards achievement of the state's goals for a cleaner, more distributed electric system. Thank you, and Warren, Marco, and I are available for comments. Or available for questions, sorry.
Or comments.
Also for comments.
Thank you. So thank you, Ted. I find this to be a set of clear, concrete, and useful recommendations that deliver progress towards our goals of clean, smart, and valuable deployment at the fairest and most cost-effective economics. I'm intending to support this item. Commissioner Sayre.
As part of REV, we're restructuring the market for energy, and paradoxically, we have to set market rules and even in some cases have to set prices in order to move toward our goals, which include not just clean energy and more distributed energy, but also the use of market forces and competition as drivers to get us to where we want to go in terms of these goals, which also include more choices and lower costs and better service. I sometimes feel in this endeavor like we are steering the Queen Mary through a very narrow channel that hasn't yet been completely charted. I see this item as a series of rudder tweaks that get around a few shoals and keep the ship on course. I think staff's recommendations are well reasoned, well supported, and I support the item.
Some excellent metaphors today, Commissioner Sarah. Commissioner Berman.
Well, I could do your hammer one, but this one I can't, so. So thank you to staff. I know you worked really hard on this, and you've been working really hard. And you can see that you put a lot of thought into this and tried to capture modifications from the staff white papers that would help to set the course. I do have a couple of questions. One relates to, in here, NYSERDA and their role, where we direct them to be more transparent, not that they're not transparent, but we direct them to be more transparent on the website. Could you go into a little bit about that and that specific?
Sure. So I can certainly kind of point to a couple specific parts of their website that we currently use and that I think generally are fairly good, but could use even some more detail. One is they have a specific VDER webpage that gets updated primarily with information from the utilities regarding the availability of currently the market transition credit in each utility, and that also kind of shows you the progress of projects in each utility territory. So that would be updated to include further details based on this order on both the community credit availability from the utilities as well as the community adder availability directly from NYSERDA. So that would essentially be updated and a little additional information provided there. In addition, in the open data platform that's used by across all state agencies, NYSERDA provides information on the number of projects built in New York, in particular through New York Sun, and through other NYSERDA programs for clean generation. So those are both areas that would be kind of further updated and detailed based on this order. And then in terms of their expenditure of funds, that really would come through the reporting they provide us quarterly in some cases and annually in others.
Thank you. Would NYPA be involved in these projects based on the changes in this order?
So there's nothing that changes in this order that relates to NYPA. There is currently the ability for solar to be put on rooftops of NYPA buildings and feed into the Con Edison system. And that's already in Con Edison's tariff and reflects essentially what was in the transition order. But that doesn't then go to NYPA customers, it goes to other Con Edison customers. And there's nothing in this order that would change that as being the current option for NYPA buildings.
Okay, thank you. And to the extent that we've had prior orders that talked about the MTA working with Con Ed on regenerative braking, what does this do in here, and what is the status?
So I believe there are still discussions underway on that between Con Edison and the MTA, and potentially, did we discuss that potentially there's some pilot that they're working on getting into motion? I don't think there's any kind of steel in the ground yet, but I think they're working on a pilot on that. That wouldn't be eligible for a market transition credit or community credit, but the changes in, for example, demand reduction value and capacity value calculations could potentially apply to that type of project if and when it becomes effective and connects to the utility system and starts providing energy.
Okay. And has our finance folks looked at this from a fiscal perspective and what this means? If all these changes are...
In terms of this order? So that the capacity value, many of the changes are designed to essentially be kind of neutral with prior with the prior orders, and we have taken a look, as we move from the MTC to the community credit, to ensure that still fits within that 2% target net revenue impact cap that the Commission initially set in the transition order. So essentially, we've made sure that we are kind of moving around the way that money is distributed, but not spending more ratepayer money.
And our finance folks have looked at this and have blessed your analysis?
since we weren't changing anything, there really wasn't a need to impose it on their time. I'm not sure what we would have had the finance folks look at.
Okay.
Yeah, I think essentially I took a spreadsheet from the transition order that had originally been developed by Warren working with some of the finance folks who were involved back then. And I basically, with Warren kind of looking over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't screwing up any of the equations, updated that spreadsheet to reflect the new numbers and make sure that it still fell within the same guidelines.
I think it might be prudent, though, to always have our finance folks look, even if you think that it's not changing anything. My preference would be that our finance folks are under the hood a little bit on that, even if it's to confirm old numbers that may not actually still be relevant or need some updating or have found to be forecasted wrong.
Certainly take that into consideration in the future. Certainly makes sense.
Yeah. So there's this new community credit. We're taking money from uncommitted funds.
For the community adder, I know the
Community
names are
adder,
similar.
right.
For the community adder, we're taking it from uncommitted funds. For the community credit, it's money that utilities would have spent on the market transition credit, just spent in a slightly different way.
Right. I am always very concerned about these uncommitted funds that always seem to be able to be found whenever we need money, and I'd like to really try to address that. It gets back to the transparency on the website from NYSERDA and the New York Sun funds. I think it's very hard to track, even for those who know where to look for it and know how to read them. And we do need some more, we need to instill public confidence, but investor confidence as well. And to the extent that all of this does come with ratepayer funds attached to it, and potentially, especially with the community credit, we may wind up looking at future charges on customers. So I think I'm really very hesitant without some drilling down, and that, in fact, this aspect of it could have been looked at by our finance folks as well, because there are dollars attached to it, and making sure that we are in our oversight role with NYSERDA as well, looking at what that is, and also engaging on if that's the proper usage of the funds for that. It's really important to me. I don't normally do this. I was disappointed, and say this publicly, I was very disappointed that I did not get this order till 9 o'clock Monday night to look at. It is too significant of an issue. And it then led to not being able to be fully briefed on it until the other day. And there's a lot here. Now, you can point to the staff white papers as something to say, well, we just made modifications to that. It's not good enough, especially because it requires going through not just the white papers and looking at the potential modifications, but it really goes through looking at all of the different things that this hits. It's not just VETR, and as we know, even in VETR, that's a big bucket of issues. It's in all of our different, a lot of our different REV proceedings. We talk about community distributed generation. There's a whole slew of them as well. We also have in rate cases and other cases that may not be attached to VETR and community DG and rate cases where we have said, we're going to address this in a future case. Now, I am confident that staff has captured a lot of that, but the reality of you're capturing it and my feeling comfortable substantively are two different things. It's not unheard of that I might vote differently or think differently than my fellow commissioners and staff. So therefore, it's important for me for a detailed analysis and going back over all of those different orders and things that it may touch. We're also not addressing the standby rates, and we're also adding in community credit and using uncommitted funds. I'm a no from a philosophical perspective, but I think that we need to do a better job. And I have talked about this internally before. It's not the latest item I've ever gotten, but it's becoming enough of an issue that I need to say I can't feel comfortable voting on an item without much more engagement. And it's incumbent upon everyone to make sure that before I vote on an item that I am comfortable. And so I share that with you. It's not to take away the hard work that you've done. And in fact, I did think that you and your fellow colleagues really were committed the other day to working with me in going through it. But it's not good enough. So therefore, I'll be voting no.
Just for good order's sake, I'll note that I heard that comment as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Lisi.
Thank you. I'm viewing this as a ticket to the path forward. I fully anticipate that years down the road we're going to look back at this and say that was quite a step to get us where we are now, and where we will be down the road will be built upon, as I said before, the hard work and determination of the staff. I'll throw in the brain trust as well. So thank you for your hard work, and look forward to whatever this brings us to down the road in pursuit of what we're looking for as far as energy and the environment and a better life. I'll be supporting it.
Thank you. So we'll now proceed to call for a vote. My vote is in favor of the recommendations to adopt with modifications the recommendation in staff's white papers regarding value stack compensation and capacity value compensation as discussed. Commissioner Sayre, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
No.
Commissioner Alisi, how do you vote?
Yes.
The item is approved and the recommendations are adopted. We will now move to the consent agenda. Do any commissioners wish to comment on or recuse from voting on any items on the consent agenda? Commissioner Sayre?
No.
Commissioner Berman?
Yes, I have a few items I'd like to comment on. On item 265, which is in matter of earnings adjustment mechanism and scorecard reform, supporting the Commission's reforming the energy vision. This is an order eliminating the interconnection earning adjustment mechanism. On October 24th, 2018, staff proposed the Commission eliminate the interconnection earning adjustment mechanism. This draft order will do that. I have concerns with this. I do note that the joint utilities raised concerns in eliminating these because the IEAMs were carefully negotiated in rate cases as part of an overall package intended to support REV objectives. So to now eliminate can add uncertainty to both the rate case process and undoes negotiated resolutions. That is a concern for me. I think the joint utilities, rightfully so, raised these concerns. These resolutions were relied on by the utilities to plan their investments and objectives. It was also relied upon those who entered into joint proposals. I do understand others like the city and MI view that differently, especially because it doesn't seem compelling evidence that the IEAMs represent an effective use of ratepayer funds. AEEE and IREC and the Clean Energy Parties also warned about getting rid of this and says that should have more time on this. I do think that we need to keep in place keeping them in place during the duration of applicable rate year in order to bolster not only utility confidence but those public confidence who entered into this as part of the rate settlements or rate cases in EAMs as a source of earnings may have been a better approach. It is odd to me we're still moving forward with the system efficiency AAM proposals in the next major rate filings when here we're sending a signal that you can enter into these in rate cases, but we may undo it later before the end of the rate case. As you know, I've raised issues on rate cases where we generically have boilerplate language that says, oh, and by the way, REV objectives may change things, so you're forewarned. I think we need to get under the hood more on that. And even if I disagree with the way something lands in a rate case and in order, if it has been agreed to we should really have much more of a focus on why we're now undoing it. I do understand and recognize the analysis for that, but I think that we need to be mindful of the concerns and truly lay that out more clearly when we enter into something that, like this, may wind up showing that it's not necessary to do. So I just raised that from that perspective. I also raised that there are several streetlight items. I'm not going to go into detail on them. I think it's appropriate. I am noticing a trend in the press world where I am seeing a lot of articles now looking at streetlights, and they range from being happy that they're getting streetlights, but they also range from those who are either upset that it's taking too long, or that there are issues with some of the parameters of what's being done. I think utilities unfairly get tagged as being part of the problem, and I think that it could be, from a stakeholder perspective, all of us now taking a look under the hood, and NYSERDA had done years ago a analysis, a white paper with I believe a consultant on streetlights and the benefits and the barriers, and to the extent that we now have a track record on these streetlights proceedings, I do think that that it is important for whether it's the commission or the state to really take a deep dive and see how are they panning out, especially if municipalities are now finding that they may have some challenges to what they saw as potentially good investment, to make sure that they are being properly dealt with. There was one recently, there was a municipality, I believe, that was concerned about signing on to it because of need that the utility needed for emergency response planning, to the extent that that may impact us. We also need to look at that. So I just raise it. I don't have specific facts, but I am getting concerned about it and want to make sure that we're truly helping to not only enable the market, but to provide the communities with something that can help alleviate their energy costs a little bit, as well as provide other benefits to them. So it's important for us to look at that. Then on item 376, which is the recommendations of the 2008 Outcome-Based Earnings Adjustment Mechanisms Collaborative Report, I will be concurring on this. I do have concerns. UIU, again, is raising, rightfully so, and we're not paying attention to it, that their opposition to incentives for air source heat pumps due to concerns that the resources may cause future growth. So to the extent that in this collaborative report, which we are adopting, I do think it's something that this is not the first time that UIU has raised this concern. It gets to the heart of reliability and resiliency, and it gets to the heart of cost impacts, and we need to take a deeper dive. It's not enough for us to just acknowledge that they're raising it. They're raising it for a reason, and we need to really take a careful look at what that means. It doesn't just go to air source heat pumps, but anything that has potential impact is important. This is also where the Con Ed MTA regenerative braking issue is, I believe, in this item as well. So I do think that that's something that I'll be following, and to the extent that we're looking at that, it's helpful, because that, again, is something that could be helpful to customers. So with that, thank you very much. I have no other comments.
Commissioner Lisi. Thank you. So with that, I call for a vote on the consent agenda. My vote is in favor of the recommendations on the consent agenda. Commissioner Sayre, how do you vote? Aye. Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
So I forgot one item, too. I am voting no on 562, which is the charter item. And I am voting on 265. I'm voting no, and 376. I am concurring with reservations based on my comments, and all others I'm voting yes on. Sorry.
Thank you. Including the streetlight items, which you had general comments about. Thank you. Commissioner Lisi? The items are approved and the recommendations are adopted. Secretary Burgess, is there anything further to come before us today?
There's nothing further today. The next meeting is May 16th.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We are adjourned.